Everyone knows the basic story of Adam and Eve. They were the first humans created by God in the Garden of Eden. All was well until a snake tricked Eve into eating an apple, then Eve tricked Adam, then God kicked them both out and it turned into a whole thing. Well, here's the real story of Adam and Eve. If you actually read Genesis, you'll notice God creates the universe and everything in it twice, and the two accounts directly contradict each other in some places. If you don't take the creation story literally, as many Christians and Jews don't, then it's not an issue. But it's a huge problem for some biblical scholars who believe Genesis was one story completely written by Moses. Some people in history have gone to great lengths to make the two versions mesh, like when they made Adam a hermaphrodite. In the first version of creation, it says God formed Adam and Eve at the same time, and the story used the phrasing, male and female, he created them. Some early Christian theologians decided this meant that they were made to have both sexes, and while many church leaders were uncomfortable with that idea, it stuck around as a theory for centuries. The two versions of creation are also where the idea of Lilith comes from, and Jewish mythology says she was Adam's first wife. She later became a demon, as usually happens in these stories. Lilith is the woman mentioned in the first creation story, while Eve is the one made later from one of Adam's bones. It's always important to remember that if you're reading the Bible in English, you're reading a translation. This becomes especially vital when you learn things like Eve was created from one of Adam's ribs, because that's not what the original Hebrew word means. Biblical archaeology says the word Selah appears 40 times in the Bible, and the only time it's translated as rib is in reference to Eve. It usually refers to the side of something, so this leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And interpret people have done. A legitimate biblical professor put forward the idea that Eve was in fact made from Adam's baculum, which is a penis bone that's extremely common in mammals. Even other primates have one, and Dr. Zioni Zevit thinks Genesis holds the answer as to why humans are missing it. If God took a bone from Adam, then his descendants presumably wouldn't have that bone. Men have an even number of ribs but are missing the baculum, so it stands to reason, he says, that's the real bone God formed Eve from. It seems like such a minor thing, and it's the question of whether or not Adam and Eve had belly buttons. But it's far from minor and has been a theological nightmare for millennia. If they had them, then they have the scar of a gestation that never occurred, so why would God put it there? On the other hand, if they didn't have them, how are they perfect representations of humans? The book Did Adam and Eve Have Navels details just how big a deal this debate was, and includes a record of a congressional committee getting involved in the debate in 1944 when it objected to a pamphlet given to soldiers that included an image of Adam and Eve with belly buttons. The debate has been a huge problem for artists through the centuries too. Some just added a few convenient navel-covering leaves, but many left Adam and Eve with completely smooth stomachs. In a bizarre twist, the belly button debate has met the evolution debate. An 1857 book said the fact Adam and Eve had belly buttons proved the Earth was only a few thousand years old. All the seemingly older stuff, like the fossil record, was just the Earth's version of an unused belly button, a past history of the Earth that never existed except in the divine mind. Ask anyone what fruit Adam and Eve ate to make God angry, and they'll tell you it was an apple. But if you actually read the Bible, it doesn't say anything at all about what specific kind of fruit it was. In English translations, it's just the fruit on the tree. Even if in the original language, the Hebrew word is peri, which is equally as vague. According to NPR, peri has been interpreted in different ways by different Jewish scholars, who have identified it as a fig, a grape, a pomegranate, an apricot, or even wheat. Still, others thought of it as an intoxicating drink like wine. So why is everyone so sure it's an apple? Because of a pun. In the 4th century AD, Pope Damasus decided the Bible needed to be translated into Latin. The scholar Jerome was given the job, and when he got to the mention of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he apparently decided to make a pun. In Latin, malus means evil, but it also means apple. So the fruit of the tree that introduced Adam and Eve to evil was an apple. John Milton really cemented the image when he called the forbidden fruit an apple twice in Paradise Lost. The human race has big skulls and slim hips, so childbirth is extremely painful. Even before epidurals, there were plenty of ways to make birthing a baby less horrible for the mother, but for a long time men said no because Eve's sin of eating the forbidden fruit meant women had to suffer. God does punish Eve in Genesis 3:16 when he says, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children." But as pointed out by Christianity Today, there's a translation issue here. The original word used means labor, toil, or work everywhere else in the Bible, and it's only when talking about giving birth did translators decide it also included pain. Women in the throes of labor pains might not care about the deep theological implications, but religious men through the centuries sure have. Martin Luther once wrote that women should be thrilled they got to gloriously suffer to bring forth babies, and a New England pastor once volunteered the opinion that alleviating the pain of women in childbirth would deprive God of the pleasure of their deep, earnest cries of help. This theological argument resulted in a huge backlash when pain medication started being used during labor in the 1800s. Since God allegedly demanded that there be pain, taking it away was sacrilegious. In the 1800s, scholars started to understand more about the ancient Egyptian civilization. Texts were being deciphered, monuments were dated, and a lot of the stuff was really old. But it also caused a crisis in religion, forcing people to ask how, if the Bible is literal and Adam and Eve were only created a few thousand years ago, could this Egyptian stuff be older than that? The pre-Adamite theory held the answer. Pre-Adamite is a 17th century idea that simply suggests that there were people alive before Adam. In Genesis, only Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel have been mentioned by the time Cain murders his brother, and the pre-Adamite theory explains where his wife came from, along with all the other cities that suddenly appeared. Some Christians also liked this idea because it meant some people on Earth were descended from people who weren't Adam and Eve, and it allowed for the argument that those people were not as important. Shocking no one, that idea was used to justify slavery and explain just how some people's lives could be worth more than others. There were lots of people throughout history who believed the Garden of Eden was a real place, and some of them set out to find it. This was complicated, since Genesis says it's where one river splits into four, and that's it. That's not a lot to go on, and it's safe to say even Indiana Jones wouldn't be able to follow that map. Christopher Columbus was just one explorer who was invested in finding the Garden of Eden, and he thought he was close when he landed on Hispaniola, and even closer in Venezuela. David Livingstone declared once it was at the source of the Nile, although he was mad with malaria at the time, and the Methodist minister William Warren wrote a book in 1881 explaining how he figured out Eden was located at the North Pole. The 20th century saw proof it was in Ohio, Florida, and Mongolia, while the New York Times reported some residents of the Seychelles were hoping to rediscover Eden on one of their islands. Other theories include Azerbaijan, Armenia, Bahrain, South Carolina, Somalia, or submerged in the Persian Gulf. The most commonly accepted location over the years has been Iraq, but that's not even clear-cut either. If you go to that country wanting to visit paradise, there are two competing places that both claim to be the real Garden of Eden. There is often an assumption that Christians believe the creation story in Genesis is absolutely literal and that Adam and Eve actually existed. There definitely are people who believe that, but in America at least, they're dwindling. According to a Gallup poll in 2017, only 38% of adult American Christians surveyed believed God created Adam and Eve as fully human individuals about 10,000 years ago. An equal amount believed evolution happened but with God's guidance in some way, and 19% of the group believed in a God-free evolution process, with Protestants more likely to believe in some version of evolution than Catholics. Even evangelicals are starting to break from a strict interpretation, along with many Christian scholars who are finding new ways to merge faith and science. In this, they are just following what the original writers of Genesis probably had in mind. Christian scholars have long believed it was originally written as allegory and poetry more than history. So where did the idea of a literal interpretation come from? It wasn't until St. Augustine started thinking deep theological thoughts about creation in the 4th century AD that anyone said it should be taken literally. In 2018, tabloids and other less reputable news sources reported on a study published in the journal Human Evolution. If you believed the headlines, scientists had proven the existence of Adam and Eve. They traced our genetics back and discovered we all come from one couple who lived tens of thousands of years ago. Of course, that's not how anything works, and the story was largely misreported. The study was only looking at mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA, which leaves a whole lot more chromosomal DNA that could and almost certainly did come from other people. Despite her misleading nickname, Mitochondrial Eve was supposed to represent the most recent common mitochondrial ancestor of all living humans, not the first human woman ever. But so many news stories got it wrong that the researchers had to release a statement saying they believed in evolution and were not saying there was a single Adam and Eve, and they definitely weren't a couple. Scientists narrowed the time mitochondrial Eve was on Earth to 100,000 to 230,000 years ago, and a Y chromosomal Adam that probably lived about 75,000 years before her. And scientists were definitely not saying these two people were the first people on Earth either. It was strange this was reported on at all, considering it wasn't even a new idea. A 2013 study in the journal Science made headlines for coming to the same basic conclusion, and it just goes to show that it's very, very important to read the fine print.
The story of Noah's Ark is one of the most beloved Old Testament tales. Noah built that ark for a long time, then there was the Great Flood and all the animals boarded 2 by 2 and so on. But what's the real story of the ark? Here's the untold truth of Noah's Ark. One of the most famous supposedly Noah's Ark sites is the admittedly very boat-looking Duripinar site in Turkey. According to Atlas Obscura, the site was exposed in the late 1940s after a series of earthquakes and storms. What's odd about this place is how long it has persisted as the remnants of Noah's Ark, when it was excluded as a possible resting place for the famed ship during the first initial investigation in 1960. No evidence has been found that there is any ship there, nor has any actual petrified wood been located there, with the exception of a few fragments that probably arrived in a mudslide. The boat-shaped formation is actually just rock and hardened mud. It appears boat-like, but contains no evidence of the timbers or iron fastenings that would have been used in a large boat's construction. Oh, and all that petrified animal poop on the site really doesn't prove anything either because of the whole animals have been roaming the world for millions of years problem. In 2010, a group of evangelical Christian explorers announced they'd located the remains of Noah's Ark near the summit of Mount Ararat in Turkey. According to National Geographic, the team says they found a structure comprised of 7 large wooden compartments. When they radiocarbon dated the wood, they determined it was roughly 4,800 years old, which is precisely in the right range to correspond with the biblical Noah story. Not everyone thinks that really proves anything, though, even if it's true. NBC News says the structure is more likely to be an ancient shelter than a giant boat. And it's also a problem when someone goes into that kind of expedition without an innate sense of skepticism. Stony Brook University archaeologist Paul Zemansky put it like this: "I don't know of any expedition that ever went looking for the Ark and didn't find it." Tales of catastrophic floods are not just limited to what we've read in the Old Testament. As it turns out, there are a lot of very old stories about horrific floods, and some archaeologists and geologists believe the stories might be based on things that really happened, however embellished they may have become over the years. According to ABC, one such theory was put forward by 2 scientists at Columbia University who believed the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake that became inundated by rising seawater from the Mediterranean. In 1999, the theory attracted the attention of underwater explorer Robert Ballard, who you might remember from such historic discoveries as the wrecks of the Titanic and the Bismarck. Ballard's team found evidence of an ancient shoreline 400 feet below the surface and determined through radiocarbon dating that the area was likely flooded during the time of the biblical Noah. Ballard claimed to have also found structures in the area, but we really haven't heard much about the expedition since those first reports came out 20 years ago. These days, Ballard seems more focused on mapping the seafloor on the opposite side of the planet. In 1872, an Englishman named George Smith discovered a cuneiform tablet that told a familiar story about a guy in a boat and a humanity-killing flood. According to the New Yorker, all the specifics were there too, including the mountaintop the ship eventually landed on and the whole dove incident. There are some differences though. In the Mesopotamian version, it wasn't one god, but the ancient Mesopotamian gods and goddesses who flooded the entire world and everyone in it. Also, the gods didn't decide to wipe out all of humanity because it had become all corrupt and unsalvageable, but mostly just because humans were vaguely annoying. So here's a tip: don't do things that gods find annoying. Another thing the cuneiform tablets had in common with the Noah story is the building instructions. Although the ark itself isn't constructed in the same way in each story, there are enough details and measurements provided that someone should be able to use them to construct their own vessel, just in case. A lot of the debate about Noah's Ark has to do with the amount of weight a ship that size could have actually supported. Obviously, it would have sucked if Noah had spent all that time building a ship and loading it up with animals, and then it had sunk anyway because there were too many dang animals on board. According to The Telegraph, in 2014, a group of master students at Leicester University decided to settle the question. They used the biblical measurements to calculate the size of the ark, then they used the density of the water to figure buoyancy, and from there determined how much weight the ship could endure before sinking. Their conclusion? Noah could have put 70,000 animals on board and the ship would have floated.
And what do you know? It floats!
That was my plan all along.
There are issues with their conclusion, though. For example, the measurements figured on Noah's boat being so heavy that the water level would stop just below the top of the ship. which means it would have been pretty vulnerable to waves, especially the sort of waves that were happening as the storm raged on for 40 days and 40 nights. And the study did not calculate things like the physical size of each creature, only its weight. But it did prove one of the larger questions about the feasibility of such a voyage, so hooray! One problem that the Noah's Ark story seems to avoid is the whole issue of genetics. When Noah and his family got off the ark, their only Tinder options would have been, well, Noah and his family. It's not just long-held social taboos and the overall ick factor that warns us against inbreeding. It's been scientifically proven to be a super bad thing. Even with 8 people as a base, the gene pool would be too small to make world repopulation feasible.
Okay, on the count of 3, say what level of cousins we would have to be for this to be okay. 1, 2, 3.
5th.
Unacceptable no matter what.
This is never gonna work.
According to the BBC, you can look at history for an example of why inbreeding is bad. Charles II of Spain was so disabled he didn't learn to walk until the age of 8. And that's because of all the inbreeding in his extended background. The number of identical inherited genes he got from both parents was higher than if his parents had been brother and sister with the normal tree before that. So that explains a lot about Joffrey Baratheon.
I am the king!
And it makes you wonder how the current human population could have waded out of such a dangerously shallow gene pool. The Bible gave very specific measurements for Noah's Ark, which not only provided early readers with a solid set of details in an otherwise implausible story, but also paved the way for giant replicas of Noah's Ark at theme parks and tourist attractions. In 2012, a life-sized replica of the Ark opened in the Netherlands and has been welcoming 3,000 paying customers a day ever since. According to Today, the replica took 3 years to build and cost more than $1 million. And then Kentucky just couldn't resist getting on the bandwagon, and in 2016, a life-sized replica of Noah's Ark called Ark Encounter opened in Williamstown. Inside the Ark are exhibits that include, among other things, cages filled with dinosaurs. So if you're a science person, you might want to give that one a pass. So there's this whole little thing called science that sort of gets in the way of the Noah's Ark legend, and science is pretty sure that evidence for a catastrophic worldwide flood just doesn't exist in the geologic record. According to the Skeptical Inquirer, you can find evidence of drying in some parts of the world that correspond precisely to the time the Earth was supposedly completely covered with water. There are other examples too. The dunes and other desert deposits that exist in various places on the planet would not be there if the world had been inundated by water. And if there had really been a flood that covered the entire world, most of the sedimentary rock on Earth would lie at the bottom of the ocean. But the continents are covered with sedimentary rock, which contradicts what we would expect if there were a flood 5,000 years ago. And that's just geology. Archaeology causes even more problems, especially when you look at Turkey, where the Ark supposedly came to rest as the floodwaters were receding. Stony Brook University archaeologist Paul Zemansky explained, "We know what's going on with Turkey archaeologically at that time, and there's no major interruption in the culture. Dangerous hobbies aren't really anything new. Lots of people climb mountains without safety gear, jump off cliffs wearing wingsuits, and participate in sports as nonsensical as extreme ironing. But when you combine dangerous hobbies with dangerous obsessions and a desire for discovery-related fame, well, that can be fatal." Over the years, a lot of people have become obsessed with the idea of finding Noah's Ark. Most of them have teamed up into proper organized expeditions, which tend to be safer than traipsing off into the wilderness alone. But some people, like Donald Mackenzie, set off alone in search of the Ark. Unfortunately, Mackenzie's obsession ultimately led to his disappearance and presumed death. On his way to see the site located earlier in 2010, he got caught in an early blizzard and disappeared. So maybe there was enough room for all those animals, and maybe the Ark could support all that weight, and maybe it somehow miraculously didn't get inundated by storm waters. But if it really did float for 7 months, how was there enough room on board for all the food necessary to sustain all those animals, and how did 8 people manage to do the job of caring for them all?
So I really have to be amongst these beasts?
Yes, sir.
All right. You don't have to hit them or nothing?
No, don't ever hit them.
Okay.
Anyone who's ever worked at a zoo can tell you that housing a bunch of animals in small spaces isn't just about throwing food at them and shoveling tons of poop overboard. According to the National Center for Science Education, each cage has to be specifically designed to meet the needs of each individual species, from the height of food and watering troughs to the diameter of the bird's perches. As the story goes, Noah found land with the help of a dove, who returned to the Ark carrying an olive branch, proof that the floodwaters were finally receding. But according to the Skeptical Inquirer, water and trees don't exactly mix.
I got it! Oh my God, the tree's in the water! I gotta get it! I gotta get it! I gotta go!
In the biblical tale, the Ark floated for 5 months before it came to rest at the top of Mount Ararat. But a 2016 study found that an olive tree submerged in water for just 3 months died. Another experiment showed that submerged grass died after just a month underwater. That would have left the herbivores with nothing to eat after disembarking. And Noah's vineyard, which he planted shortly after the flood, would also not have survived because the soil would have become too saturated with salty seawater. Everything would have been salty.
Salt. Cracked black pepper.
And that's just the botany part of the equation. What would happen if you released thousands of herbivores and thousands of predators back into the same environment? You'd end up with a lot fewer than the 2 of each herbivore unless you gave them a head start of a decade or 2. Anyone who has seen Waterworld knows that when the polar ice caps melt, the world will be covered by oceans, and everyone will live on implausible-looking boats and spend all their time searching for the mythical dry land and drinking their own pee. A Waterworld-like scenario would never actually happen, though, because there literally is not enough water on Earth to cover the entire world. According to the American Museum of Natural History, if all the ice on Earth melted, sea levels would rise about 230 feet, which would mean the end of most coastal cities, but would stop far short of actually covering the entire planet. So if there really was a worldwide global flood, all that water not only receded, but somehow also left Earth altogether. But really, that's probably the least of the story's problems.
The Antichrist is usually understood to be a really bad guy who makes everyone worship Satan and who has something to do with the end of the world. Many Christians fear him, while others want him to show up so Armageddon can start. Here's the story behind the Antichrist. The Antichrist goes hand in hand with the Bible, so it's weird how little the Holy Book mentions him. In fact, the term Antichrist only appears 4 times, and all in the book of John. But John doesn't talk about one evil guy who is going to come at the end times. He says there have already been lots of Antichrists, including absolutely everyone who doesn't believe in Jesus.
But you're not a Christian, so what do you believe?
Even outside of the Bible, early Christians didn't care much about the Antichrist. While he never used the word Antichrist, the idea of a single person who would go against God comes from the Old Testament's Daniel. But Daniel did have a specific person in mind, the ruler of Palestine, Antiochus Epiphanes. He wasn't talking about a vague future evil entity. He was saying a specific person was horrible. It wasn't until 1,000 years after Jesus died that somebody finally wrote down who exactly the Antichrist was going to be. When the Queen of France asked a monk named Adso for specific details, he basically got free rein to make up whatever he wanted. The letter he wrote the Queen went as viral as something could for the Middle Ages, and for hundreds of years, what Adso said about the Antichrist was, for lack of a better term, gospel.
See, call me Dad.
The Queen was worried that she was living in the last days and wanted to know what to be on the lookout for. Adso believed that the Antichrist would show up at the end of the Holy Roman Empire. He'd be born a Jew in Babylon, and he'd be the most wicked man of all time. But he would look a lot like the second coming of Christ. He'd go to Jerusalem to minister, perform miracles, and rebuild the temple. Everyone would follow him, but he would persecute Christians for 3.5 years. Fortunately, the real Jesus would come to defeat him. After Adso, the medieval idea of the Antichrist was mostly set, until another monk came along in the 1100s with his own stuff to add. Joachim of Fiera was so obsessed with the Antichrist that he actually became famous in his own lifetime for being its go-to prophecy person. Other than the author of Revelation, Joachim was probably the most important apocalyptic thinker ever. He saw the end times as right around the corner. But according to Joachim, there would be many antichrists over time. Some, like Nero, Mohammed, and Sadalin, had already lived. They were antichrist more generally, but there would be a single one that would signal the beginning of the end. In Revelation, it's Gog who shows up to battle the Christians. Joachim tied the final Antichrist to Gog, using that name, and after 1,000 years, Revelation and the Antichrist were finally connected. Martin Luther started out as a monk who had some polite ideas on how the Catholic Church could improve. When no one listened to him, he published his 95 Theses and effectively started his own version of Christianity, which would become Protestantism. After that, he was locked in a struggle with the Pope, which made it pretty convenient that Luther would go on to discover the entire concept of papacy was the Antichrist. Although he didn't want to come to that conclusion, Luther was forced to when the Catholic Church refused to acknowledge the problem with indulgences and paying for salvation. He saw Catholicism, specifically the man at the head of it, as deliberately trying to undermine Christ while also trying to take Jesus' place by claiming to represent him. These things made the current pope, and indeed all the popes, Antichrist. After Martin Luther, people stopped thinking of the Antichrist as a single person for hundreds of years.
It's the Antichrist.
The Antichrist became a thing of the past, while something being Antichrist, that is, against Christianity, was in vogue. These days, it's so common to speak of the Antichrist that older documents referring only to Antichrist sometimes have the word "the" inserted in brackets in front of it, as if the original author made a mistake by leaving it out. But the Antichrist was considered a concept, not a person in need of a definitive article.
You are the devil.
So what changed? Weirdly, Nietzsche might be largely responsible for the switch from Antichrist back to the Antichrist. In 1895, he published a very anti-Christian book called The Antichrist, and the term became widespread.
God is dead.
By the 1970s, Christians had fully accepted the Antichrist as an individual again. Jesus is an important figure in Islam, so it makes sense that Islam has its own version of the Antichrist. The deceiving Messiah doesn't actually appear in the Quran, but he does come up in the Hadith, which contains sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Unlike the Bible, the Hadith goes into great detail about who he is, what he'll look like, and where he'll come from. The Hadith describes the Antichrist as a heavy-set man with one eye, a ruddy face, and curly hair. He also has Arabic letters spelling unbelief on his forehead, so he should be easy to pick out of a lineup. Much like the Christian version of the Antichrist, he'll show up during times of chaos, go to Jerusalem, be followed by the Jews and others, and perform miracles. While it's unclear whether he'll reign for 40 days or 40 years, what is clear is that Jesus will return to save the day. And, according to tradition, the Antichrist is already on Earth, but he can't show himself just yet. Name a powerful man in history, and it's guaranteed someone thought he was the Antichrist. There were the more obvious candidates, like Hitler, but anyone with any amount of authority could qualify. In fact, virtually every pope has been accused of being the Antichrist, along with Nero, Henry Kissinger, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Napoleon, among others.
Born in the image of the greatest power in the world.
U.S. presidents are a popular Antichrist contender. Reportedly, the first to be seriously accused was FDR, as his support of the UN was considered a bit too one-world government for many Christians. JFK was obviously a concern for some Protestants since he was Catholic, and a man tried to kill Reagan in 1990, telling the Secret Service agents who stopped him that he had to do it because the former president was the Antichrist. Believe it or not, modern science hasn't affected people's belief in the Antichrist. In a 2010 Harris Interactive poll, 14% of Americans thought President Obama might be the Antichrist. When broken down by political party, a full quarter of Republicans thought it was a possibility. These weren't idle thoughts either. In 2011, a heckler accused Obama of being the Antichrist at a fundraiser, and a man took shots at the White House the same year, saying God told him to kill the Antichrist president. Historically, anti-Semitism and the belief in the Antichrist have gone hand in hand, since the assumption has been that the Antichrist would be the demonic twin of Jesus, and because Jesus was Jewish, the Antichrist should be as well.
I am not an evil man.
The idea led to a lot of hatred of Jews during the Middle Ages. If the Antichrist was going to emerge from their group, the assumption was they all must be demonic and sinister. Somehow, this connection did not disappear in modern times. In 1999, Baptist Reverend Jerry Falwell got heat for his assertion during a speech that not only was the Antichrist probably already alive, but that, quote, of course he was Jewish. When called out for his remarks, Falwell tried to defend himself by saying he only meant the Antichrist must be Jewish because Jesus was Jewish. Homophobia, like anti-Semitism, has often been connected with the Antichrist. The idea goes back to the Bible's book of Daniel. While Daniel never uses the actual word Antichrist, and in fact was almost certainly talking about a specific ruler of Palestine when he wrote it, people have interpreted his mention of a single man who would defy God as being a reference to the figure. When writing about this individual, Daniel throws in this piece of information. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women. It's that last bit that some have decided to fixate on. If the Antichrist isn't going to desire women, he's gay. Therefore, being gay is bad.
You believe in the devil?
Do they look like me?
According to one TV evangelist, Daniel indicates that the Antichrist will be a sexual pervert, most likely a homosexual. Another preacher opined, "I do not believe that there is any question but that the Antichrist will be a homosexual." All this homophobia is based on one line of a text that was originally in a different language, and it's been pointed out that other translations of this scripture are much different. But for those who want to tie homosexuality to the most evil entity of all time, that's not important. Revelation 13:18 says, "This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666.
He said you're the beast.
As one historical source points out, the beast, who wasn't connected with the Antichrist for 1,000 years, almost certainly represents the Roman Empire. And 666 is a well-known Jewish numerical code that translates to Nero. Early Christians had every reason to despise Nero, as he'd openly tortured those who practiced the religion. There is nothing mystical or evil about the number, but the irrational fear of the number 666 is a real thing.
All I could think about was the number.
While most people with the phobia are Christian, it does affect those of other religions and even some with no religion. It might present as something small. For example, if a purchase comes to $6.66, they'll grab something else to buy, so the price changes. Or it can have a truly negative effect on their life, one in which they avoid the number at all costs, see it everywhere, and associate it with bad luck. Some people see Antichrist everywhere. The number 666 has been interpreted to reference the emergence of barcodes on products, the UN, the EU, even the www at the beginning of web addresses. In 1997, Procter & Gamble sued Amway because it was spreading rumors that the company was satanic and had 666 hidden in its logo. Other Antichrist culprits include feminism and the Susan B. Anthony dollar. According to a 2019 report, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church claimed smartphones were paving the way for the Antichrist. But one of the biggest concerns for the Antichrist-minded was rock music. Entire books were written on how the noise was going to lead the kids astray. The Beatles were Antichrist. The damage done by Pete Seeger was, quote, impossible to calculate. The lyrics of the Rolling Stones were satanic. In the 1980s, so-called Antichrist phobes discovered backmasking. This was the idea that rock bands were putting secret messages in their music that people could only hear when played backward.
The old gods, the rightful masters, are jealous, watching mankind with a hatred that is as boundless as the stars.
Somehow this was taken seriously. Politicians got involved, and legislation was introduced in California against musicians who were said to have used backmasking to turn their audience into, quote, disciples of the Antichrist. One witness said people only had to listen to Stairway to Heaven 3 times before the hidden messages made them worship Satan. Other states considered similar bills, and one was even introduced in Congress. None passed. The Ark of the Covenant is one of the holiest artifacts of the Hebrew Bible, so holy that looking at it or touching it could be deadly. But what actually is it, and what is it for? Here's the untold truth of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, also sometimes called the Ark of the Testimony or the Ark of God, is not to be confused with the other famous ark in the Bible, which was a boat. The word ark comes from the Latin word arca, meaning big box. Just as Noah's Ark was a big floating box for him to put animals in, the Ark of the Covenant was apparently a big box full of things important to God that would represent his presence among the people of Israel as they wandered through the desert after escaping slavery in Egypt. The Jewish Encyclopedia describes the Ark as a movable sanctuary for the Israelites, a place for God to sit until they arrived in the Promised Land and could establish a temple there. The Ark was not to be touched or looked at when uncovered. On the move, the Ark was always covered by skins and cloths, hidden even from the priests who carried it. When stationary, it was held up by poles so it wouldn't touch the ground. Even the high priest was forbidden from being in the place of the Ark except when it was necessary to perform certain rituals and ceremonies. And as the Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry explained, the top of the ark was known as the mercy seat, a lid of pure gold placed on the ark and put within the Holy of Holies behind the veil of the tabernacle, where God himself actually showed up, and the high priest would go once a year to sprinkle blood as a sacrifice to calm God down for another year.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, the chest the Hebrews used to carry around the Ten Commandments.
In Exodus chapter 25, after God has given Moses the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, he gives him detailed instructions about building the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle to house it in. The whole thing is covered in gold, with a gold ring at each corner for acacia wood rods to be placed through for carrying and holding the ark off the ground. But what goes inside it? In various places in the Hebrew Bible, the ark is said to hold the tablets on which the 10 Commandments were carved, and a pot full of manna, the miraculous food God provided for the Israelites to eat as they wandered the wilderness. The Christian epistle to the Hebrews, however, also mentions it contained a staff belonging to Moses' brother Aaron, which miraculously grew flowers and almonds in the book of Numbers. While the Israelites marched through the desert, the ark usually led the way, but whenever they set up camp, it was placed within a temporary shelter known as the tabernacle. According to Exodus, the tabernacle was basically a tent made up of layers of curtains, veils, and skins. Nobody really knows what animal those skins came from, though. The Hebrew word is takash, but comparison of different translations of Exodus shows takash is variously rendered as goat, porpoise, badger, manatee, dolphin, or sealskin. However, another theory suggests that the takash was actually an enormous wild animal with a single horn that was covered with skin of 6 colors. Does this mean that the special tent for the Ark of the Covenant was made of the skin of an enormous rainbow unicorn? We can only hope. The Ark of the Covenant was no ordinary box. The Bible shows it to possess a great power to destroy the enemies of God or remove obstacles that stand in the way of his chosen people. In the book of Joshua, when Moses' successor Joshua led the Israelites to the Promised Land, the Ark parted the waters of the Jordan River so that they could cross. And when the Ark was carried around the city walls of Jericho, the walls came tumbling down. The sacred nature of the Ark is no joke either. The book of Samuel records that somewhere between 50 to 70,000 people died immediately having just looked at the Ark out of curiosity. Even those with good intentions weren't spared, as 2 Samuel tells the story of a guy who reached out to steady the Ark when it was about to topple off an ox cart. Despite trying to be helpful, he was struck immediately dead by divine fire. The Jewish Encyclopedia also reports that the Ark not only protected the Israelites from their human enemies within the Promised Lands, but from natural obstructions found within the desert on their way there. The story goes, sparks would form between the 2 cherubim of the mercy seat and basically fire lasers that cleared the path of snakes, scorpions, and thorn bushes. Furthermore, the smoke produced by these lasers reportedly smelled like sweet perfume that alerted people to the presence of God's chair. The Ark is also mentioned in the Quran, and other Islamic sources discuss it as well, including one that adds to the contents of the Ark Moses' hat, robes, and shoes. Perhaps most interestingly, however, comes the story recorded in the Book of Sudanese Memoirs, which tells of how the Ark contained a ruby statue that looked like the head of a cat with 2 wings. The cat, despite being a statue, was vocal and meowed like the roaring of the wind. When it cried out, it caused the Ark to rush toward God's enemies and assured victory for the Israelites. The Ark of the Covenant features heavily in the Hebrew Bible from the time of Moses through the eras of King David and Solomon, and even into the time of the divided kingdom, but it basically disappears from the record around the time of the prophet Jeremiah. What happened at that time that might account for such an important artifact disappearing from history altogether?
Where is the Ark?
Well, Jeremiah lived at the end of what is known as the First Temple period. The first temple was constructed by King Solomon, possibly with the assistance of a horde of enslaved demons, based on the plans of his father, David. After 7 years of work, the Great Temple was completed and the Ark of the Covenant placed inside, in a new, more permanent Holy of Holies that was not made of rainbow unicorn skin. The end of the First Temple period came several centuries later, after Israel split into 2 nations. The northern kingdom of Israel fell in 722 BCE, and the southern kingdom of Judah, where the temple was conquered by the Babylonian Empire in 587 BCE. The temple was destroyed, and the people of Judah were sent into exile. So, what actually happened to the Ark? Was it taken to Babylon or hidden in ruins? No one really knows, but there are some pretty fascinating theories about where it might be. One proposed location for the Ark of the Covenant comes from the book 2nd Maccabees, one of a group of Greek Jewish texts thought by Christians to take place between the Old and New Testaments, and often referred to as the Apocrypha. The books of the Maccabees describe the conflicts of the Jewish people with the Greek successors of Alexander the Great, and how a great military leader named Judah Maccabee, also known as the Hammer, and his brothers led a successful revolt that led to the restoration of the Second Temple, and ultimately to the Jewish people enjoying autonomous rule until the Romans showed up. The Maccabees are pretty great reads, full of armies of ghosts, and a dude so mad at the Greeks he literally threw his own intestines at them. Anyway, chapter 2 of 2nd Maccabees is a flashback to the time of the Babylonian siege, and tells how the prophet Jeremiah, applying the kind of foresight unique to prophets, grabbed the ark, the tent of meeting, and the temple altar, and absconded with them to Mount Nebo, currently in the country of Jordan, to be hidden there until such time as God decides to reveal it. Not everyone agrees with the theories claiming that the ark was taken to Babylon, or hidden in Jerusalem, or sealed in a cave on Mount Nebo. Namely, Ethiopian Christians have claimed for centuries that the Ark of the Covenant is, in fact, in the Ethiopian city of Aksum. Per Smithsonian, the Christians of Ethiopia claim the Ark came to Aksum nearly 3 millennia ago and has been fiercely guarded by a succession of virgin monks ever since, who dedicate their lives to keeping watch over the Ark in the chapel and are forbidden to step foot outside once anointed to this duty. The Ethiopian chronicle known as the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings, records that when the Queen of Sheba went to visit Solomon to consult his fabled wisdom, she got pregnant with a son named Menelik. When Menelik later visited his father, some Israelite nobles accompanied him on his return trip. Unknown to Menelik, these nobles had stolen the ark and replaced it with a fake. Since Menelik had borne the ark all the way to Ethiopia without being destroyed, he knew it had to have been God's will. And allegedly, the ark has been in Aksum's Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion more or less ever since. Since no one but the ark's guardian is allowed to see it, who can dispute this version of events? There's no biblical artifact so famous someone won't claim it was recovered by the Knights Templar and taken from the Holy Land back to Europe somewhere.
The Holy Grail.
As Crusader history explains, the Templars, not satisfied with having attained the Holy Grail, apparently removed the Ark of the Covenant from the ruins of Solomon's Temple and took it back to the French Cathedral of Our Lady of Chartres. The theory is that the Templars, in their roles as master stonemasons, on top of being bodyguards for Crusaders, were the ones to rebuild the Chartres Cathedral as an exquisitely carved Gothic cathedral after it had burnt down. The intention being that it would be a great storehouse for holy relics and wisdom. The evidence of this can be found in reliefs depicting the transportation of the Ark. However, the Leamington Courier reports that British author Graham Phillips writes that the Templars took the Ark not to France, but to Britain. In Phillips's reconstruction of events, the Templar leader Ralph de Soudelay found the Ark among the hidden stash on Mount Nebo and carried it back to his estate in Warwickshire, meaning that it's now somewhere in England. Anything is possible, right? One of the most recent claimants to being the location of the Ark of the Covenant is the alleged tomb of Alexander the Great on the Greek island of Thasos. According to the Huffington Post, in 2012, an amazingly sketchy archaeological outfit announced they'd uncovered the final resting place of one of history's greatest conquerors. And they allegedly found the Ark of the Covenant inside as well. Thasos, which is near Macedonia, where Alexander was from, has long been rumored to be where the Great One was buried. So the announcement of finding his tomb there was not entirely unexpected. But why would the Ark of the Covenant be buried with him? Well, according to Jewish historians, Alexander did in fact go to Jerusalem, where he was shown a copy of the Book of Daniel, which prophesied that a great Greek leader would conquer the Persians. Seeing this, he was apparently satisfied and left Jerusalem alone. However, there was no mention of Alexander the Great taking one of the holiest items of all time, which had been missing for centuries since the destruction of the First Temple. Whether or not this really happened is anyone's guess, but it goes without saying that the Ark of the Covenant remains one of the world's most interesting mysteries.
You're probably familiar with the Nativity story, but the truth about Mary and Joseph, the two parents at the heart of the story, is often brushed aside when talking about Christianity's main man, Jesus. But Mary and Joseph are interesting characters. Here's the untold truth of Mary and Joseph. In Mary and Joseph's time, women's purity was valued as a currency, something that would sweeten the deal between marriage negotiations and family. There were no paternity tests back then. If you wanted kids that you were sure were yours, the best insurance was marrying a virgin. So imagine your girlfriend shows up after visiting her cousin for 3 months with a big old baby bump. You can probably picture the reactions.
Pregnant? Holy crap!
Everyone, not just Joseph, was freaking out. Mary would have been considered damaged goods and not marriage material. It didn't help that she was claiming this was God's baby. So Joseph planned to end their engagement. According to National Geographic, Joseph was just trying not to make the situation worse. But don't think Joseph was insensitive for wanting to dump Mary because she was unexpectedly pregnant. Breaking up was actually the classiest move Joseph could have made at that time. Think about the story of the Nativity as if it happened today. A teenage girl from an extremely conservative society gets engaged, visits her cousin, and comes back visibly pregnant. Mary was an OG and kept to her story that the Holy Spirit had gotten her pregnant, but people were as skeptical of the idea back then as they would have been today.
I am the Virgin Mary. That's my story and I'm sticking to it.
Joseph tried to be nice about it. Matthew 1:19 described how he planned to separate from her quietly so the public wouldn't shame her. But shame her is a nice way of saying stone her to death. Deuteronomy 22:21 and the surrounding verses lay down the law that if a girl got intimate while unmarried, she would be stoned to death for bringing shame upon her family. But Joseph didn't want this to happen to her. Later on, the angel Gabriel visited him in a dream and reassured him that yes, Mary actually was going to have God's kid. So Joseph doubled down on his good guy stance and took on Mary as his wife, even though she was pregnant. Tablet describes how Joseph has taken on a newfound popularity in modern times, as people have realized just how important he was to keeping Mary safe. People have realized that without him, the birth of Jesus definitely wouldn't have happened. Shocking.
Sweet baby Jesus.
Once the angel visited Joseph and confirmed that Mary was really going to have God's kid, Joseph got on board immediately. But this also extended to after the birth of Jesus. God, perhaps impressed by how cool Joseph had been throughout this whole ordeal, sent another angel to Joseph, telling him that they had to pick up and leave immediately. He obeyed, and they fled what turned out to be a massacre of all kids in Bethlehem younger than 2 years old. King Herod, whose name you may remember is one of the more popular Sunday school villains, had sent people out to kill any child who might be the Messiah, after running into 3 kings on their way to visit Jesus. Apparently, he was worried about another king trying to take his place, and you know how kings are about being kings.
I am the king!
Joseph has also been shoved aside in favor of the Virgin Mary in the eyes of a lot of believers, since she had to carry Jesus and bear the social stigma of the pregnancy. But that's beginning to change. In 2003, Pope John Paul II spoke about Joseph setting an example as someone who believed in the messages he received from God, but also stayed humble and didn't seek attention as God's stepdad. The National Catholic Register sang his praises in 2011, recommending him as someone Catholics could go to for divine help in parenting. It's explicitly stated in the Bible that Joseph and Mary didn't consummate their marriage until after Jesus was born and they bailed to Egypt, which makes sense since Mary was pregnant most of the time they were initially together. But even this viewpoint is pretty revolutionary in terms of how believers view Mary. There's a healthy group of people, mostly Catholic, who believe that Mary never lost her virginity, ever. The perpetual virgin view of Mary is used as a way to honor her alleged holiness and purity as the Mother of God. National Catholic Register points out that people who believe this theory do so partly because of the lexicon surrounding families at the time. Whenever men are referred to as Jesus' brothers in the Bible, that doesn't necessarily mean they're Jesus' brothers by blood. They could be his cousins or other family members, or maybe even just his friends. There is another story about the life of Jesus that may have been altered through the lens of pop culture. It's quaint to picture Jesus learning how to build things out of wood with his dad. It's like they're alluding to the imagery of the stable of his birth and his future death on a cross. It also fits the idea of Jesus' beginnings being humble. The Bible even tells a story of when Jesus was roasted in his hometown of Nazareth when he came back as an adult to perform miracles. They said things to the effect of, "Wait, how does the son of a carpenter know all these things?" In the ancient Greek that the Bible was translated from, Joseph is referred to as a tekton. According to a Greek-English lexicon, tekton can mean a carpenter or wood joiner, but is commonly used to describe any craftsman or woodworker. Some theories allege that this means Joseph may actually have worked with stones or large materials. An author cited in the Telegraph claimed that Joseph may have been a master architect who provided Jesus a comfortable upbringing. Sorry to disturb anyone's assumptions, but Christ was not white. Jesus may have been played by white actors in a lot of films, but that's definitely not how it went down in real life. A breakdown from Live Science suggests that if Jesus took after Mary at all, he would have had olive skin and was probably of average height for the time. Mary probably looked like other Israeli Jews, or maybe with a slightly darker complexion. She also would have been pretty average looking, since the Bible goes out of its way to specifically mention whenever someone is particularly attractive, and it didn't do that with Mary.
I'm painting the birth of Jesus as it was and as it always will be.
No. Here's how you're gonna paint me, all right? Serene and gorgeous.
James Martin wrote in Slate that we can't forget that Mary was probably 14 years old at the time when she gave birth to Jesus, something that was common for the time. She probably would have been arranged to be married around the time of her first period. Just in case you needed your nativity scene to be even more awkward. Mary had it harder than most women when it came to childbirth, even when you consider the time period. She presumably had Joseph to help her, but she had no experienced midwives, which were available to expecting mothers back then, according to the Jewish woman. Mary also, thanks to circumstances, had to give birth in a smelly place outside of her own town away from her family. That would have been hard on anyone, but add on a difficult labor and it becomes a whole other story. In the Quran, Mary has to give birth with her back against a palm tree for support. She says out loud, quote, "Oh, I wish I had died before this and was in oblivion, forgotten."
Congratulations, Mary, it's a boy. And you didn't die during childbirth like most women do in this time. It's a miracle.
Mary has a whole chapter about her in the Quran and is the only woman mentioned by name, according to the BBC. Her chapter talks about the birth of Jesus and the immediate aftermath. According to PRI, it also features a story about baby Jesus speaking up in his mother's defense when people said she wasn't a virgin. Guess if you have all the knowledge in the world, you really have all the knowledge. In case you haven't noticed, there are a lot of paintings of Mary. The young mom of Jesus has been featured in probably more paintings than anyone who ever lived. In a lot of these paintings, Mary's portrayed wearing a light blue shawl or hijab. It's a light, airy color, not unlike the robe worn by her son in the most expensive painting on earth, Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi. But is Mary's blue covering accurate to history? Probably not. The Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge confirms that clothing for women Israelites was lighter and more brightly colored than men's clothing. Assyrians of the time wore blue tunics as undergarments, but that was relatively far from Mary's hood. Alatea describes how Mary's blue covering is really an allusion to her purity and closeness to God. She doesn't wear the white of a saint or the red of a Jesus-killing emperor. Blue is the color of special woven tassels worn by Jews at that time to remind them to follow the commandments. In short, Mary wears blue in paintings to symbolize that she is just that much holier than anyone else painted with her. In Catholicism, there are a lot of books besides the Bible that people debate over in terms of authenticity. Some people dismiss them outright. Other people take them in consideration alongside the Bible. Some of these extra texts for Catholicism are called the Apocrypha writings. Catholic culture describes them as documents that didn't make it to the Bible, compiled by people who wanted to know more about Jesus. Even if they're not true, they say a lot about what people thought about Jesus and his place in the culture not long after he was alive. If these writings can be believed, Joseph had a first wife named Melcha. According to the Catholic Dictionary, the Apocrypha states that Joseph was a widower with 6 children who asked to marry Mary after his wife died. This fits the pop culture image of Mary being much younger than him. It also fits with the idea of Mary being a perpetual virgin, but Jesus still having brothers and sisters. They could have been stepbrothers and sisters. If it's true, it provides a very different image of Joseph, an older guy who's already done the marriage and babies thing who has this new wife who's pregnant somehow, but he still steps up to be stepdad of the year. One of the most consistent parts of the nativity story is that Mary had to give birth to Jesus in a stable full of animals. The town was full of people coming to Bethlehem, and apparently no one was nice enough to let a heavily pregnant woman take their adjoining suite, so they took the only space available. Now, people of that region at this time didn't keep their animals in stables the way we do today. Think of a home in biblical times as the ultimate open concept home. People would sleep in what was essentially the second floor while doing chores and other everyday work on the base floor. The base floor was also where the animals were brought in at night. Newsweek reported that this was likely where Jesus was born, not in an entirely separate structure built outside of a house. What most likely happened was that Joseph showed up at his extended family's house, was told that there wasn't enough room in the sleeping quarters for Mary to give birth, and so they had to make do with the gross basement where the animals hung out. It wasn't so much people being monsters to a pregnant woman as much as Joseph's cousin Fred arrived early and scored the last couch. There's more to Moses than the Ten Commandments, and a lot of it is incredibly strange. If all you know about God's number one boy is Prince of Egypt or Charlton Heston in a wig, here are some lesser-known facts about Moses. One of the most famous stories of Moses deals with his birth and how he escaped execution at the hands of a murder-happy pharaoh who was trying to reduce the Jewish population in Egypt. Moses' mother put the infant in a basket floating down the Nile, where he was ironically rescued and subsequently raised by the pharaoh's daughter. According to the book of Exodus, Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses from the Hebrew word masha, meaning to draw out, because she drew him out of the water.
Because I drew you from the water, you shall be called Moses. Moses. Moses.
Now, if you're asking yourself why an Egyptian princess would give a mysterious river baby a Hebrew name, you're not alone. Most modern scholars suggest that Moses' name is probably of Egyptian origin, but Exodus includes a folk etymology to downplay the Egyptian background of the Hebrew hero. While no definitive origin for the name Moses has ever been determined, theories about the name include it coming from an Egyptian word meaning son of, while the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria connected it to the Egyptian word for water. Other theories range from the princess giving him a Hebrew name because she saw the baby was circumcised to Moses' own mother actually recommending the name when she worked for the princess as a nurse. The canonical scriptures skip from Moses' infancy to his young adulthood, leaving a lot of gaps concerning his life at the pharaoh's palace to be filled in by popular imagination. The Jewish Encyclopedia records one of the best-known legends of the child Moses, which involves him snatching Pharaoh's crown. According to the legend, 3-year-old Moses is sitting at the dinner table when he grabs the pharaoh's crown and puts it on his own head. The pharaoh's soothsayer worries that this is a sign that the child is the prophesied future liberator of the Jews in Egypt. Fortunately for young Moses, one of Pharaoh's counselors is actually the angel Gabriel in disguise, looking out for God's favorite boy. The secret angel proposes a test and sets out a piece of gold as well as a live coal in front of Moses to see which one he grabs, with the understanding that a hero of destiny and greatness would surely grab the gold. To make sure that won't happen, Gabriel supernaturally guides the child's hand to the coal. Being a baby, Moses obviously puts the burning coal in his mouth. Pharaoh's mind is set at ease that a prophesized hero would never do anything that dumb, and Moses' life is saved. Your familiarity with the life of Moses may mostly consist of the trip down the river and the parting of the Red Sea. What you may not remember, however, is that the inciting incident to Moses' role as prophet and deliverer of the people of Israel was a murder. Well, maybe a manslaughter, but either way, he killed a dude. In chapter 2 of Exodus, the young adult Moses witnesses an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave. Thinking no one can see him, Moses kills the Egyptian and buries his body in the sand. The movie Prince of Egypt makes this look like an accident, but it was definitely premeditated. Later on, when Moses tries to stop a fight between two Hebrews, one of them mentions the killing. At that point, Moses knows the jig is up and books it out of Egypt and toward Midian. In chapter 4 of Exodus, when the fugitive Moses encounters God in disguise as a shrubbery, he receives his call to action to become the great deliverer and lawgiver of the Israelite people. However, like any good hero, Moses tries to refuse this call, specifically noting that he's a bad choice because he's, quote, heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. Much debate has ensued about what this description literally means, but the traditional explanation is that Moses had a speech disorder, most often understood to be stuttering.
And you shall free my people from Egypt.
Why me? A man clumsy with words.
According to some, this stutter was the result of baby Moses putting that coal in his mouth, but it has also been suggested that God specifically chose someone with a disability to be a spokesman so that all the glory would go to God and not to his human representative. Sigmund Freud, on the other hand, thought maybe the boy raised in Pharaoh's household couldn't speak Hebrew at all, while others theorized that he spoke with a heavy Egyptian accent or simply spoke slowly. The most popular explanation, however, is the stutter, with various other verses used to back this up. God helps Moses get over his hesitation by telling him his brother Aaron can do the actual talking part. One of the strangest and most confusing incidents in the Bible occurs in chapter 4 of Exodus, when Moses is on his way back from Midian to Egypt with his wife Zipporah and their son in tow. While Moses and his family stop at an inn, God tries to kill Moses. Probably. These 3 bewildering verses contain a bit of pronoun trouble. Someone definitely tries to kill someone, and God trying to kill off Moses makes the most contextual sense. Anyway, Zipporah stops God from killing her husband by cutting off their son's foreskin with a rock and throwing it at God's feet, and then tossing out an amazing one-liner. Truly you are a bridegroom of blood. The traditional understanding is that God was angry at Moses for not circumcising his son according to God's covenant with Israel. In this regard, Zipporah's quick and dirty bris saved Moses' life, but her bloody bridegroom quip is still hard to parse. Still, hard to ask much more of your wife than that.
Who makes you happy?
You do. Moses is the most important prophet in Judaism, and overall one of the most important dudes in all of the Bible. However, most modern biblical scholars say that the Torah wasn't actually written by Moses, or by any single person for that matter. Instead, they say it's a composite of multiple documents that were edited together. And in the earliest of these documents, it seems like Moses' role was even more prominent and had to actually be toned down by communities who liked Moses' brother Aaron better.
He's my brother. Moses!
According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, in the earliest sources for the Torah, Moses did everything, and the only mention of Aaron was when he built the golden calf for the Israelites. The reason for this seems to be that the earliest sources were written by Moses fans, while later documents were written by those partial to Aaron, who featured him much more as Moses' helper and spokesman, as well as softening his culpability in the golden calf incident. Aaron's main role in tradition is that of the first high priest, which attributes to 90% of Aaron's references in the Bible. One of the things that most distinguishes Moses from other prophets is the personal nature of his relationship with God. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy says, "No prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." According to the book of Exodus, this isn't a metaphor. After Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and brought them the law from Mount Sinai, he and God would hang out and chat. Exodus chapter 33 says, "The Lord spoke to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks with his friend." It seems God was disguising himself in these instances, however, because Moses asked to see God's full glory. And even though God says no man can see God and live, he figures out a compromise for his best bro. God agrees to reveal his full glory to Moses in order to encourage and reward him. But since the unvarnished image of God is deadly to the human mind, God says that Moses would have to stand in the corner facing the wall, and after God walked by, Moses could turn around and look at God's back. According to Exodus chapter 34, Moses' constant close proximity to the face of God had an unintended consequence on the prophet. His face became so radiant that you might even say it glowed, and this change actually made some people for hundreds of years think that Moses had horns. According to Haaretz, the Hebrew word for ray of light can also mean horn. So it's possible to interpret Moses' shiny face as a horned one if you take the less contextually appropriate translation, which unfortunately it was when St. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin. European Christians used this version until basically the Protestant Reformation, with the most notable cultural consequence of this being Michelangelo's famous sculpture of Moses in Rome's Basilica of St. Peter in Chains, which prominently features two horns on Moses' brow, perplexing thousands of modern tourists daily. One of Moses' most famous roles is as the liberator of the Jewish people, leading them out of Egypt through 40 years of wandering the desert and into a land of milk and honey promised to them by God. As such, it might surprise people not deeply familiar with the story of the Torah that Moses himself never actually made it to the Promised Land. Of course, the walk from Egypt to Canaan is definitely not 40 years long. What happened is that when the Israelites got to the Promised Land, Moses' advance scouts reported that the land was full of giants, which made the people too scared to enter.
We have new laws preparing us for the Promised Land. If we are true to God, He will keep His promise.
For their lack of faith, God cursed them to wander until that entire generation had died in hopes that the next generation would be more faithful. Once that time had passed, however, Moses found out that God wasn't going to allow him to enter Canaan himself. Instead, he died on a mountain within eyeshot of the Promised Land at the age of 120, and God himself buried him in a mystery grave. As pretty much the main dude of Judaism, naturally there's more stories about Moses than most other prominent figures from the Hebrew Scriptures. The incident of Moses' death is no exception to this trend. However, there is an apocryphal book that might shine a supernatural light on the mystery of what really happened to Moses. The Assumption of Moses is a story so crazy that it didn't make it into the Bible. The story goes that God hid Moses' body so that the idol-prone Israelites wouldn't begin worshiping their leader's corpse the way they had the golden calf. Satan, on the other hand, thought this would be hilarious, so he tried to steal Moses' body. God, however, had placed the Archangel Michael as the guardian of Moses' grave, and when the devil tried to uncover the body, Michael rebuked him, forcing him to flee. Unfortunately, as interesting as this story sounds, we don't have much more information on this divine tug of war over Moses' corpse. It's generally understood that the oldest alphabet we can verify the existence of is the Phoenician alphabet. For some Greco-Jewish historians, however, it's obviously Moses who invented the alphabet and then passed his version on to the Phoenicians. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, a widely quoted fragment by the historian Eupolemus claims, Moses was the first wise man, the first who imparted the alphabet to the Jews. The Phoenicians received it from the Jews, and the Greeks from the Phoenicians. Also, laws were first written by Moses for the Jews. Inventing the idea of letters and the very concept of law is pretty big. The historian Artapanos went a step further, claiming Moses was the figure known to the Greeks as Musaeus, the teacher of the great musician Orpheus. And oh yeah, he was also the deity known to the Greeks as Hermes and the Egyptians as Tot, the legendary figure who taught the alphabet, science, and mathematics to humankind, so he's kind of a big deal. Despite Moses' role in the development of 3 different major world religions, most modern scholars generally reject his literal existence as a historical person, though many accept that the legend of Moses may be based on certain details from the life of a Moses-like historical person. One reason that Moses is considered to be more legend than fact is that some details of his life can be seen echoed in the stories of a number of other legendary figures. The most prominent of these repeated motifs is the story of the baby Moses being rescued from the river. According to the Ancient History Encyclopedia, the Mesopotamian king Sargon of Akkad wrote a fiction-heavy autobiography in which he related that he was born the illegitimate child of a priestess who sent baby Sargon in a basket down the Euphrates River, where he was rescued and eventually became a conquering king. Likewise, the story of the Hindu hero Karna and even the Greek story of Oedipus follow the same basic pattern. Hey, if you're gonna plagiarize, why not steal from the greatest story ever told? Humans have been burning the bodies of the dead for thousands of years, although when the practice specifically began is difficult to say. The practice was introduced in Europe and the Mediterranean region around 1000 BCE by the ancient Greeks. Why did they start doing it? Well, when it comes to war and conquest, burning the bodies of the dead served multiple purposes, not the least of which was clearing the battlefield of rotting corpses quickly and efficiently. More importantly, for many religious people today, the practice of cremation was introduced right around the time many of the historical events in the Old Testament were taking place. So does the Bible actually say anything about cremation, like whether it's a good or a bad idea?
Lucille.
I do have this coupon for a cremation.
Actually, it turns out that while the Bible talks a fair amount about what happens to the body after death, it's rather thin on the topic of cremation. Throughout the Bible, when the narrative refers to what happened to a body after the death of its occupant, the person is almost always buried, or like Jesus, placed into a tomb carved out of the rock, which was in keeping with the custom and culture of Palestinian Jews at the time. In fact, cremation is mentioned directly only once in the Bible, in 1 Samuel 31, where the narrative describes the bodies of Saul and his sons being burned and their bones being buried under a tree. By comparison, the Old and New Testaments together contain around 200 references to burial, entombment, and the like. And of course, one rather important narrative in the New Testament, found in Luke 24, involves Jesus' friends going to his tomb to tend to his body and finding it empty. So does the Bible's near silence on cremation mean that Christians should embrace the practice or avoid it? As is often the case with these doctrinal matters, that depends on whom you ask. Some Christians believe that their physical bodies will be resurrected from the dead at some point in the future, and as such will require an intact, i.e. not cremated, body. Though of course, since bodies decay after being buried, some would argue that this is a logical fallacy, and there's nothing actually in the Bible that says you shouldn't cremate someone. Theologian John MacArthur told Christianity.com, "The scriptures do not say anything about required modes of burial for believers. So if Christians are pretty much left to themselves to decide if cremation is right for them according to their personal or doctrinal traditions, what about Jews? You know, the people that wrote the Bible." As it turns out, Judaism has put a lot more thought into this than Christianity, with the result that there's far less ambiguity. Under Jewish tradition, cremation, generally speaking, is a no-go. Cremation company Neptune Society notes that for thousands of years, Jewish tradition held that the only acceptable means of disposing of a body was burial in the ground for a variety of reasons. Perhaps most importantly, cremation was seen as a pagan practice, and as such, one that Jews should avoid, as they sought to remove themselves from those types of funerary procedures. Also, cremation does not fulfill the Jewish religious obligation of burial. More recently, the painful memories of the Holocaust and the way the Nazis disposed of the bodies of the Jews create a negative association with cremation in the minds of some modern Jews. According to MyJewishLearning.com, for most Orthodox and conservative Jews, cremation is off the table, while Reformed Jews, who are generally more liberal in their beliefs and interpretation of doctrine, don't believe that it's necessarily sinful, but that it should be discouraged. Orthodox and conservative rabbis may even discourage families from fulfilling the deceased's wishes that they be cremated, as they feel the person will understand the need for a traditional burial once they have departed. If you've ever been told you look like an angel, you probably took that as a compliment. But a closer look at the Bible reveals that maybe you should have felt insulted. Today, there's a stereotypical look that most angels have when shown in works of art or popular culture. Generally, angels are depicted as beautiful, pale-skinned humans with wings, wearing white robes, carrying a harp, and sporting a halo. But this look is far from the actual version of angels described in the Bible. Biblical angels were generally strange, frightening creatures, ranging from human lion, ox, eagle hybrids to floating wheels with eyes. Biblical angels struck fear into the hearts of anyone who witnessed them. One of the most vivid descriptions of angels in the Bible comes from the prophet Ezekiel's inaugural vision. Ezekiel, of course, is probably best known in pop culture for this.
And you will know my name is the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
Quentin Tarantino slightly altered the original text, but you get the idea. Besides that famous line, Ezekiel also wrote extensively about angels. He describes two main types of angels. The first are the cherubim, which is plural, the singular is cherub. Today, cherubs are typically depicted as chubby little babies, but the Bible disagrees. According to Ezekiel's vision, every cherub had the face of a human being, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. If the combined faces of 4 different species aren't frightening enough, cherubs also have 2 sets of wings, one for flight and the other to conceal their bodies. Additionally, per medium, cherubs have straight legs and shiny bull hooves. Weird, right? But the second type of angel described in Ezekiel 1 is even more bizarre. Meet the Ophanim. According to Medium, Ophanim comes from the Hebrew word for wheels. It's a fitting name because Ezekiel's vision suggests that some of God's angels are actually floating, eye-covered wheels that sparkle like jewels. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. Then there are the seraphim, which are described in the book of Isaiah as floating around God's throne singing his praises. I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. If you're keeping count, that means that the seraphim have 1 more set of wings than the cherubim, but lack the extra faces. There is one other type of angel that's more human-looking though, which are God's messenger angels. Per Blue Letter Bible, the angels that God chose to deliver his messages could take a variety of corporeal forms. Most commonly, they would appear nearly identical to a human male. This is true for the warrior Archangel Michael, who first appears in the book of Daniel. It likewise applies to the Archangel Gabriel, who informed Mary that she would give birth to Jesus. In fact, most of the angels referenced in the New Testament appear to be more human-like and tame than their frightening Old Testament counterparts. For example, Luke describes the angels at Jesus' tomb as, quote, 2 men in shining garments. This might give you the impression that the angels you see in popular culture are accurate depictions of angels as they're described in the New Testament, but not so fast. In the Bible, cherubim and seraphim are the only types of angels described as having wings. Messenger angels like Gabriel have none. Similarly, the classic depiction of cherubim as flying babies was adopted from an ancient Italian art of carving winged babies into child sarcophagi. More modern still is the idea of angels playing the harp, which was popularized by John Milton in his 1667 epic Paradise Lost. And they said you couldn't reinvent the wheel.
You might know Lilith as Adam's real first wife who preceded Eve, or maybe as the first vampire, or a succubus. Heck, in the chilling adventures of Sabrina, Lilith is Satan's concubine disguised as a high school teacher. But where did the legend of Lilith come from, and what's her real story? If you read the first few chapters of the book of Genesis in the Bible, you'll notice that there are 2 accounts of the creation of human beings that are slightly different. The first, in Genesis 1:27, says God created man and woman at the same time, both in his own image. Chapter 2, however, gives the more familiar expanded version where God makes Adam out of the clay and then makes Eve from his rib. The discrepancy is likely because the Bible's original editors were trying to stitch together different versions of the creation story into one master text. Most Christians simply treat the second version as an expansion of the first, but in the tradition of Rabbinic Judaism, it's widely held that these are accounts of 2 different women, the first being Lilith and the second being Eve. So what's Lilith's story? The earliest version of what modern readers would recognize as the Lilith legend comes from the collection of satirical proverbs known as the Alphabet of Ben Sirah, written sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries AD. And it's a doozy because it says that Lilith and Adam broke up because they disagreed about who should be in the dominant position during intercourse. Unwilling to accept a subservient position since they were created as equals, Lilith blasphemes by shouting the unspeakable true name of God and then literally flies away. Lilith's unwillingness to accept an inferior status hints at why Lilith has become a modern-day feminist icon. The part about her killing babies, though, not so much. Here's the rest of the Ben Sira account. After flying away, Lilith basically turns into a demon mom and begins giving birth to scores of demons every day. God tries to convince her to go back to Adam, but she refuses and instead hunts Adam's offspring, the children of mankind, in retribution. There's another tradition, though, like the one from the sect of Jewish mysticism called the Kabbalah, which posits Lilith and the dark archangel Samael were created by God as dark mirror images of Adam and Eve. Some Kabbalah texts even suggest Lilith was actually the serpent in the Garden of Eden who tempted Eve. Still, other traditions say that Lilith isn't just any demon, but rather the queen of demons. A seducer of men, this demon queen version still hunts children, but could be warded off with special amulets. In this context, the legend of Lilith generally was used to explain high child mortality rates in ancient times and teach societal norms about intercourse and the subsequent care of children. So even the evil demon version of Lilith has her good side. Before the Hebrew stories that became the Bible, though, there were earlier legends that many scholars believe formed the foundation of the Lilith mythology. A prototype for Lilith can be found in the Sumerian poem The Epic of Gilgamesh, which itself is basically a first draft of the Bible. And artifacts dating back as far as the 7th century BC seem to invoke protective magic against Lilith. Perhaps the biggest influence on the Jewish mythology, however, would be the Assyrian demon Lilith. The name Lilith seems to be the feminine version of Lilu, an Akkadian name which is related to the word for demon. Some scholars believe the name Lilith is also related to the Hebrew word for night, while others argue it comes from the Sumerian word for wind, all of which may explain why in ancient legends, Lilith was mostly seen as a winged demon of the night. The single actual reference to Lilith in the Bible appears in Isaiah 34:14 in a passage describing the destruction that will be found after God lays his judgment on the nation of Edom. It says that thorns and brambles will grow over the city and its walls will become a home for jackals and owls. It goes on to say that the city will be filled with hyenas and satyrs and, quote, "There too shall Lilith repose." Different translations reinterpret Lilith as all sorts of weird things, from a donkey centaur to a screech owl. Some versions translate Lilith as Lamia, which makes sense as in Greco-Roman mythology, Lamia was the name of a queen who turned into a child-eating monster. And some amazing versions of the Bible even straight up translate it as vampire. That interpretation is the one that has gained the most traction in pop culture, as everyone from Marvel Comics to the 1996 movie Bordello of Blood to the HBO series True Blood has depicted Lilith as the queen of the vampires. Demons, vampires, donkey centaurs. Is there anything she isn't queen of? Despite being a figure that does not appear at all in the canonical Bible and that only arises from folklore, tradition, and foreign mythology, Lilith has enjoyed great success as a character in various forms of popular culture. She is, for example, a major player in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, where she is arguably the main antagonist, the mother of demons, and Satan's very jealous concubine. The archetype of the evil wife that Lilith represents also informed the choice of naming Fraser Crane's cold, somewhat controlling wife, and later ex-wife, Lilith Sternin. On the flip side of that portrayal, a more modern reappraisal of Lilith's character would reveal her as a woman who was punished for demanding equality, and as such, she became something of a feminist icon, giving her name to the popular 1990s all-woman touring music festival, Lilith Fair. And then there's the seminal anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion, in which Lilith is revealed to be the name of the second angel. Lilith likewise can be found sprinkled all across pop culture, from books to movies to anime to video games such as Castlevania, Final Fantasy, and Darkstalkers. Sometimes she's depicted as a vampire, sometimes a demon, sometimes a succubus, and sometimes just a domineering wife. However she's depicted, it's clear that Lilith has transcended her pseudo-biblical roots to become a major part of pop culture today. Who's on top now, Adam? No matter what you're looking for, you can probably find it in the Bible. Many people are familiar with the more popular Bible animals like Jonah's whale and the menagerie on Noah's Ark, but there are lots of other weird creatures in the Bible that you might not have covered in Sunday school. It's sort of common knowledge at this point that those white lady with wings angels that we all grew up with don't appear anywhere in the Bible. Angels are more of a culturally accepted shorthand than a straightforward adaptation of the source material. So why did artists across the centuries decide to depict the heavenly host as white-garbed, blonde-haired bird women, and not the way they were described in the text? Probably because if you saw pictures of what angels were supposed to look like, they'd haunt your nightmares. In Jewish tradition, there are 10 orders of angels, and the Ophanim are considered some of the most holy. There's a lot to go into, and parts of the description come off a little like a fever dream, but essentially, Ophanim are flaming gyroscopes covered in eyes, guarding God's seat of power. That's a little harder to paint on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The behemoth is one of a handful of creatures in the Bible that historians have been arguing about for quite a while. Scholars can't agree on much about this puppy, but they know two things. He was big, and he had a belly button. The book of Job describes Behemoth as a giant reed-dwelling creature that's too powerful for anyone except God to control. Depending on the interpretation, it could drink an entire river, and its strength was significant enough to be worth mentioning 4 times in a single paragraph. But besides big and strong, the closest thing we get to a descriptor is a line about how, quote, his force is in the navel of his belly. So aside from the superpowered belly button thing, what could the behemoth have been? Most modern literal interpretations point to either a hippo or an elephant, but there's also some debate as to whether it was just a metaphor for the power of God. The second creature described in the behemoth passage of Job is the Leviathan, and where the behemoth leaves quite a bit of wiggle room for visual interpretation, the Leviathan is bizarrely well fleshed out to the point of making the behemoth seem like an unloved afterthought. No, really. Job goes into staggering detail describing all of the wildly upsetting aspects of this creature's body. Whereas the behemoth is considered the beast of the land, the Leviathan calls the water its domain. It has double-thick armor plating running down its back and muscular folds all over its body. It breathes fire. Its skin is impenetrable, tough as stone. It honestly reads more like a description of Godzilla than a Sunday school story. As with the behemoth, the Leviathan has been the subject of plenty of debate over the years. Unlike the behemoth, however, the language used to describe it doesn't leave a lot of room for poetic license. While people have theorized that it may have been a crocodile or a particularly weird whale, it's a little difficult to square that with fire-breathing rock monster. The descriptively named first beast is laid out for the reader in Revelation 13:1. Also called the beast of the sea on account of its oceanic point of origin, it sports 10 horns with crowns on top of them, the name of blasphemy written across all 7 of its heads, the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. It's also described as taking a lethal beating to one of its heads before miraculously healing itself. The first beast shows up again a few pages later in Revelation 17, when an angel pops its head in to explain that the creature was a metaphor for mountains, and also a metaphor for kings, and also, well, Revelation has never been the easiest nut to crack, you know? Revelation's second beast is a mysterious son of a gun. Introduced at roughly the same time as beast number 1, this shady fella emerges from the earth in what you have to assume is a pretty dramatic spectacle. It has the voice of a dragon and the horns of a lamb? Huh. The second beast acts as sort of a hype man for the first beast. In Revelation 13, it's seen convincing human beings to worship the first beast, pulling stunts like making the sky rain fire. It also has the dubious honor of branding the hands or foreheads of its followers with the mark of the beast, an enigmatic physical sign indicating fealty to the forces of darkness. There's no mention of whether or not this is its way of compensating for its only remarkable feature being a pair of lamb horns, which rank pretty low in terms of intimidation factor on the list of possible horns to have. The King James Bible includes a staggering 34 different mentions of dragons, which is pretty undoubtedly a matter of creative translation. Some are just allusions lending themselves to colorful hyperbole, like when Deuteronomy says that wine is the poison of dragons. But Isaiah comes riding in with some literal monsters to slay. According to chapter 13 of Isaiah, after Babylon falls, its palaces will be infested by dragons, as well as satyrs and, oddly enough, owls.
What's going on here?
We're owl exterminators.
Oh? Then you won't have any problem exterminating this owl!
Dragons appear again in chapter 34, where they take up residence in another city that's Hulk-smashed by the wrath of the Almighty. Things get even more intense in Revelation, as they tend to do. There, we see that Satan takes the form of a great red dragon, fighting angels in a heavenly battle royale. In a stunning upset, one particular angel lays on a smackdown and banishes the creature to the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. It's worth noting that of the many uses of dragon in the King James Bible, 17 are derived from a Hebrew word which is alternately translated as whale in Genesis 1:21 and sea monsters in Lamentations 4:3, making it kind of a catch-all for big, scary animal. Rounding out the list of Bible animals that seem more at home in a D&D campaign than in Scripture is the cockatrice. It shows up 3 times in the King James translation of the book of Isaiah, generally in foreboding passages and descriptions of the works of evil men, all of which leads to one important question. What is a cockatrice? For the benefit of the more outdoorsy kids in the crowd, a cockatrice was a mythological creature that was a lot more popular in the Middle Ages than it is these days. It was a sort of low-key dragon, a winged, 2-legged serpent with a rooster's head. As fun as it is to imagine weird chicken snakes on Noah's Ark, all signs point to the inclusion of the cockatrice being a strangeness particular to medieval translations. While the King James Bible brings it up, other versions have a killjoy habit of interpreting the Hebrew root word as adder or viper. In a twist that will come as a shock to nobody at this point, yes, there are unicorns mentioned in the Bible. It just sort of depends on which Bible you read. See, the Bible is funny. A lot of it has been interpreted and reinterpreted hundreds of times in just about every language. Different societal situations at different points in time have yielded wildly diverse understandings of what the original text meant, with some words having more than one meaning and others having no direct translation at all. Sometimes blanks needed to be filled in. And that's one explanation for why the King James Bible, first printed in the early 17th century, mentions unicorns not once, but a whopping 9 separate times. They're generally used as a point of reference or a metaphor, but all that changes in the book of Isaiah. In chapter 34, God is on a hot streak, cutting down sinners with a sword filled with blood and ram kidneys. It's foretold that while this happens, unicorns and bulls will overrun the land and lay the place to waste. Everybody knows a cherub when they see one. They're the pudgy, lovable cupids sprinkled around staff rooms in confetti form around mid-February every year, shooting love arrows into the hearts of even the most stalwart bachelors. Unless, that is, you read the source material, in which case they skew a little more toward terrifying chimera than pinchable angel toddlers. As described in Ezekiel, the cherubim are an angelic order with a lot going on physically. They have 4 faces for starters, including an eagle, a lion, an ox, and a human. Each one of them had 4 wings, too, as well as straight legs capped at the end with shiny bronze bull hooves. They're traditionally given a series of heavenly duties, maybe most famously guarding the gates of Eden. In some traditional teachings, they're considered the 9th highest order of angels and associated with the task of helping people move beyond their sins in order to be closer to God. And for fans of raiding lost things, they're also what's described as being sculpted onto the lid of the Ark of the Covenant in Exodus. As with lots of biblical creatures, the cherubim have shifted visually over time. As popular art changed, they became thematically intermingled with the Greek-Roman god of love, Cupid, or Eros, and are now visually synonymous with the lovable winged babies we're all familiar with. In Genesis, shortly after Adam and Eve were 86 from the Garden of Eden, people started getting on with the business of making more people. While a lot of that went down about the way you'd expect, there were some glaring irregularities as well. It was a hectic point in the biblical timeline, and a lot of strangeness gets ever so slightly swept under the rug, at least in terms of the things they teach in Sunday school. Exhibit A, the Nephilim. In Genesis chapter 6, it's relayed that the sons of God, usually interpreted as fallen angels, noticed that the human ladies were looking pretty alright. The angels got hitched to human brides, and the resulting progeny were the Nephilim, a race of violent giants. How giant is giant? In numbers, they're described as being roughly to people what people are to grasshoppers. So, big. The Book of Enoch, an apocryphal religious text that didn't make the final cut of the Bible, said they were nearly a mile high. They're also considered to have been symbolic of the corruption God felt he needed to wipe out with the Great Flood. Wait a minute, talking animals?
Yes!
There are two prominent talking animals in the canonical Bible. The first is a gimme. In Genesis, Eve is tempted by a snake with more interest in her nutritional intake than you tend to see in a standard reptile. The second one is a little more obscure, but just as strange. In Numbers, we meet Balaam, a troubled prophet. Long story short, Balaam is on a road trip, but God doesn't feel great about it, so he sends an angel to mess with the donkey Balaam is riding. The angel, invisible to Balaam, freaks the donkey out, making it veer off course and smack Balaam against a wall. Balaam gets angry at the donkey and smacks it around. That happens a few times, and then God gives the donkey the power of speech.
Are you talking to... me?
After he and donkey chat for a while, the angel shows himself to Balaam and says that if the donkey hadn't been dodging him, the angel would have killed Balaam by now. Balaam repents and goes about his business, and apparently never checks back in on the whole "I own a talking barnyard animal" development.
Pop culture is filled with depictions of fallen angels, once holy beings that have succumbed to sin. But how and why did the idea of fallen angels even come about in the first place? Here's the untold truth of fallen angels. Fallen angels are basically angels that have given up on the good and righteous path and turned to evil, right? Well, not necessarily. It's true that Jewish and Christian traditions believe that fallen angels were originally just as holy as any of the other angels, but fell when the most beautiful of them, Lucifer, decided to rebel and enticed others to go with him. But in Hindu traditions, it's a little different. They believe the creator god Brahma actually made some angelic beings good and some evil from the very beginning. Why? Because it's meant to illustrate the natural order of things and balance in the universe. And fallen angels don't even exist in Islam, where tradition says that all angels are good, including the ones tasked with overseeing those whose evil souls have landed them in hell. These angels are lording over hell, yes, but they aren't fallen, as they are still doing divine work. There's another explanation for Satan there too, and it basically says he's not an angel, he's a jinn, a creature made from fire and free will. Put a pin in that because there'll be more about this pesky free will stuff later. Historically, those who believe in fallen angels typically have believed them to be responsible for things like tempting mortals into sin, and fallen angels are tricky about it too, sometimes masquerading as good angels as they torment and tempt. How do believers know all this? Well, these days, most of it comes from the non-canonical book of Enoch, which was written about 350 BC. The text claims to be the revelations of Enoch, who was taken up to heaven and told the universe's deepest secrets, then shown just what would happen during mankind's ultimate judgment. Enoch shows up in other texts as well, which claim he lived to be 365 years old and eventually told his tales to his son, Methuselah, who lived to be an impressive 969 years old. Strangely, even though the stories of Enoch were influenced by the mythology of places like Babylon and in turn influenced Judaism and Christianity, the only place that all 100 chapters of the book survived was Ethiopia. And among those chapters was a fascinating explanation on fallen angels. One of the most widely told tales of fallen angels says it was Lucifer who rebelled against God and brought a bunch of angels down with him. But the story told in the book of Enoch is very, very different. It tells a story of lust. According to the book of Enoch, long before the Great Flood, angels and humans met and mingled pretty commonly, and the inevitable happened: children. Those sons and daughters of angels were a race of 450-foot-tall giants. The angels started teaching their giant offspring evil ways, and God not only imprisoned them, but subjected them to judgment and sent the flood to hit the reset button on his creation. Enoch, the story says, tried to speak on behalf of the angels and their giant children, but sadly, a lot of the texts are missing. We do know that Enoch was the one God selected to act as an intermediary to the fallen angels, instructing him to tell them what their punishment would be for their transgressions. They were to be condemned to the ends of the earth, with an eternity of punishment to follow. Early Jewish writers considered Enoch to be a prophet, but when Christianity started to adopt his teachings, he largely fell out of favor with Judaism. Christian writers then took the Book of Enoch with them when they converted isolated areas of Ethiopia in the 4th and 5th centuries. Though the Book of Enoch was lost to the rest of the world, it was preserved in Ethiopia and was finally brought back to Europe in 1773. In the meantime, though, with the Book of Enoch to guide them, Christian scholars and writers had centuries to let their imaginations go wild, leading them to the really convoluted origin of Satan as a fallen angel. See, that's not actually in the Bible, but theologians turned themselves into pretzels trying to explain how Satan exists in the first place. The reasoning went like this: God created everything in the universe, and therefore God created Satan. But the only thing God creates are good things, so therefore Satan must have been good at one point. He also needed to have the free will to turn bad, but since he clearly wasn't human, he must therefore have been a fallen angel. Clearly, these scholars went to the Princess Bride school of logic and reasoning.
Studying, you must have learned that man is mortal, so you would have put the poison as far from yourself as possible, so I can clearly not choose the wine in front of me.
Oh, and once more, there's that free will thing. Don't worry, it'll come up again. According to the Book of Enoch, the first batch of fallen angels was each responsible for teaching humanity about a specific sin. As Baal, for example, was responsible for teaching humanity about sex, so thanks very much for that. Tamiel, on the other hand, taught humanity about demons and spirits. And then there's Sherne-Haza, who is apparently responsible for that race of giant half-angels. Those giants, if you remember, led to the imprisonment and punishment of the fallen, as well as the Great Flood, which was brought to cleanse Earth of their gigantic sins. Perhaps the strangest fallen angel of all, though, was Penimu, who was credited with giving mankind something that led to all kinds of evil, the written language. With writing came knowledge, and that, of course, is really, really bad because it might lead to free will. The big lesson you're apparently supposed to learn from fallen angels? That knowledge and free will are bad and will get you killed, so the only way to remain safe is to choose ignorance and obedience. Funny how that works. Maybe the biggest diversion the Book of Enoch takes from the regular Bible is its depiction of the Garden of Eden and the fall of mankind. Everyone knows the traditional story from the Bible. A serpent, usually associated with Satan, tempts Eve into eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There's that whole knowledge is bad thing again. And then boom, goodbye paradise. In the Book of Enoch, though, it's not Satan who tempts Eve. It's a fallen angel named Gadriel. And this is the jerk who also went on to give humanity weapons and armor and teach us all how to kill each other. Sounds like Gadriel has a lot to answer for. Quick, describe a fallen angel. There are probably some scowly faces, bat-like wings, maybe even some horns or cloven hooves, right? Maybe a double chin, who knows? But it wasn't always like that. In early Christian art, fallen angels look pretty much the same as their holier counterparts. One of the earliest representations of the idea that they were angels and fallen angels opposing each other in an otherworldly battle is featured in an ancient mosaic in Italy. Jesus is in the middle, and on one side is an angel in red with some sheep representing the home team. On the other side are the bad guys, a figure thought to be Lucifer or Satan, standing with some goats. He's wearing blue, which is the color of the damned, plus he has goats, so we know he's the bad guy, but otherwise he doesn't seem all that bad. The mosaic even suggests fallen angels kept their iconic halos, which at the time were a symbol of power, not holiness. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that images of fallen angels started turning more grotesque. During that time, something weird happened. Creatures from ancient Babylonian texts called Lilith began to be associated with Adam's non-canonical first wife, Lilith. At the same time, parallels were drawn between Satan and the ancient Canaanite deity Beelzebub, and the ancient Roman half-goat, half-man god of nature, Pan. In the 14th century, these pop culture influences led Dante to describe Satan as lording over the depths of hell while sporting bat wings, and that in turn influenced the 17th century author John Milton to describe fallen angels in his work Paradise Lost as the sort of grody monsters we think of today. Remember those theologians who turned themselves inside out trying to explain how Satan existed? Well, they faced the same issue with the rest of the fallen angels and came up with some typically convoluted explanations. Until the 12th century, pride was the typical answer as to why fallen angels fell, but that meant God would have had to create something with a crippling, all-powerful amount of pride, and that didn't fly. So scholars came up with the idea that angels had been created with a natural love that allowed them to love God, themselves, and each other. It's the last part that scholars in the Middle Ages believe caused the fall of the angels. After Lucifer fell because his love was a selfish love of power, the other angels who fell did so because they loved Lucifer. God was largely an absent, distant figure after all, and Lucifer was their friend. Rather than condemning themselves to struggle for the acceptance of an unreachable father, perhaps they followed their brother into exile. It's kinda heartbreaking when you think about it, especially once you add love to free will and knowledge as things too dangerous for mortals to contemplate. According to the Mirabilia Journal, one of the most convoluted bits of theology that grew up around the legend of fallen angels is the way Christian writers used it to excuse and promote the persecution of the LGBTQ community. Scholars have long debated about whether fallen angels and demons are capable of love, with many believing that instead, fallen angels are consumed with lust, a desire to use others for their own ends. Indeed, Christian writers as far back as the Apostle Paul himself warned women about the danger of attracting the attention of a lusty fallen angel. But since they didn't write anything about fallen angels having lust for members of their own gender, early scholars decided that meant there was something so fundamentally wrong about the idea that even fallen angels wouldn't do it. This kind of self-satisfied circular logic was used as an excuse for centuries of persecution, which still continues today. Our contemporary view of fallen angels might suggest that they kinda got off easy. After all, though they might be in hell, they aren't exactly at the mercy of the demons there because they kind of are those demons, right? Well, not exactly. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, the 7 archangels, those are the leaders of the good angels who stayed loyal to God, count the punishing of the fallen angels among their heavenly duties. Each one of the archangels was in charge of particular facets of the otherworldly life. Jeremiah, for example, kept watch over the souls in the underworld, while Michael protects Israel. Gabriel is the overseer of paradise, and Uriel leads the host. They're the ones with direct access to God, and they're also in charge of punishing the fallen. Punish how? Take Azazel, who according to some sources was the one who taught mankind how to make weapons rather than Gadriel. According to the Watkins Dictionary of Angels, Azazel was punished by Raphael, who put him in chains, threw him in a pit full of sharp rocks in the middle of the desert, and brought the darkness down on him while he waited for his condemnation after the final judgment. That doesn't sound so great after all, and it's a pretty steep price to pay for expressing love and free will. Better luck next time, fallen angels. Everyone knows that in the Bible, Cain killed Abel. But if you wonder why or how or what Cain's punishment was or how he had enough kids to populate a city, the book of Genesis leaves you hanging. But don't worry, there are answers to be found. Here's what nobody told you about Cain and Abel. Cain, the first murderer in history, is often held up as an example of the worst humanity has to offer. In fact, in the apocryphal book of Bartholomew, when the ghost of Jesus descends into hell to rescue all of the dead and take them up to heaven on the day after his resurrection, the only 3 people who are so bad that they get left behind are Judas, Herod, and Cain. According to Jewish legend, being bad might just have been in Cain's DNA. The story claims Cain isn't Adam's son at all, but Satan's. Louis Ginsberg's The Legends of the Jews relates that the angel Samael, who is the great Satan, appeared to Eve after she and Adam had been expelled from the Garden of Eden. He came in the form of a serpent and, well, you can imagine the kind of things that the world's second human and a fallen angel in snake form might get up to. 9 months later, she gave birth in a delivery so painful that when Adam heard her screams, he thought Satan was after her again. 12 angels, including the Archangel Michael, had to be called in to hold Eve down. She gave birth to a glowing baby who immediately stood up, ran away, and came back with a stalk of straw for his mom. The main story of Cain and Abel is that the 2 boys each made their own individual sacrifices to God. God decided that he liked Abel's sacrifice more, so Cain killed his brother. But one of the biggest unresolved questions around this incident is why Cain's offering was rejected while Abel's was accepted. The most obvious difference between the 2 sacrifices is that Cain, a farmer, offered up the fruits of the field, while Abel, a herdsman, offered up the firstborn of his flock. As a result, a reasonable conclusion is that God liked Abel's blood sacrifice and didn't like Cain's grain offering. But it might not be that simple. See, there was no hierarchy of offerings in Temple Judaism, so the intent of the offerer was supposed to be more important than the value of the offering. Rabbinical literature suggests Cain's error was in offering worthless portions of his crops and keeping the best parts for himself in greed, while Abel offered his first and best. Likewise, God did not disregard Cain's offering itself, but rather Cain and his offering, indicating that the problem was with the attitude with which Cain brought his fruits to God. The priestly guidelines in the Bible for making an offering would support the idea that an attitude of faith and supplication is an essential ingredient. Someone trying to escape their destiny and consequently fulfilling that very destiny is a common motif in ancient literature. A classic example is Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. The story focuses on the struggle to escape a prophecy that the infant Oedipus would grow up and kill his father and marry his mother. This struggle actually leads him to, well, killing his father and marrying his mother. The tragedy of Cain murdering his brother Abel is no exception, at least if you're willing to believe texts from outside the main biblical canon. According to an apocryphal Jewish text from about the 1st century CE known as the Life of Adam and Eve, after the birth of Abel, Eve awoke one night after a disturbing dream. In the dream, she had seen Cain with blood on his hands, blood that turned out to be his brother Abel's. What's worse is that Cain was drinking Abel's blood like a vampire in an Anne Rice novel.
I've trained you to the point of death. If I leave you here, you die.
Eve was so horrified by this dream that she told Adam about it. Trusting Eve's dream was indeed a premonition, Adam made the helpful suggestion that the best way to keep one brother from chugging the other brother's life juice was to keep them apart. What could go wrong if one son was raised to be a farmer and the other was raised to be a shepherd? Whoops. As any true crime fan knows, in order to prove someone's guilt in a crime as serious as murder, you have to be able to establish means, motive, and opportunity. That is to say, the how and why such a crime might be committed. In the case of Cain and Abel, the motive might seem obvious. Cain was jealous that God accepted Abel's offering and rejected his own, which in turn led him to kill his brother out of anger. However, the biblical account in Genesis doesn't ever state that explicitly, and so there have been a number of other interpretations over the years. Rabbinical literature supplies a number of possible motivations behind Cain's violent act outside of the common explanations. According to these sources, Cain and Abel divided their inheritance from Adam such that Cain got the land and Abel got everything else, sparking jealousy. It's also possible that they were both attracted to their mother Eve and fought over her attention. More commonly, it's believed that Cain was upset because Abel was going to marry the cuter of their sisters. Alternatively, they also argued over whose domain would house the eventual temple. The Talmud even suggests Abel showed no sympathy for Cain's dejection at being snubbed by God and sparked his anger that way. So, take your pick. If the motive behind Cain's murder of Abel is agreed to be jealousy, whether over a woman, land, or God's favor, the question that arises next pertains to the means of death. The book of Genesis gives no details, stating merely that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Fortunately, as ever, apocryphal literature steps up to fill the gaps, and common explanations for Cain's method of murder include suffocating Abel and then sawing his head off with a donkey's jawbone, slashing him with a farm implement, chewing Abel's head off with his own teeth, or simply punching him in the head until he died. The jawbone is the most common, but the Book of Jubilees, which is canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, goes for a simpler explanation. Cain whacked Abel over the head with a rock. Simple, clean, believable, and less grotesque than sawing off a head with donkey teeth. What's more, Jubilees takes this opportunity to expand some poetic justice on Cain. Cain's death comes when his house crumbles and crushes him with the stones of its walls, just as he crushed his brother. It is, like they say, he who lives by the stone will die by the stone. While Abel's story understandably ends with his own death, and he's never mentioned again in the Hebrew Scriptures after Genesis chapter 4, we do get some information on what happens to Cain after killing his brother. In chapter 4, verse 11, God curses Cain to a life of fruitless toil and wandering. Cain worries anyone who encounters him will try to kill him, perhaps a weird thing to worry about if the only other two people on earth are his mom and dad. Either way, God marks Cain, so anyone who harms him will suffer sevenfold vengeance. The meaning of the mark of Cain is ambiguous, and Cain's mark and his curse have often been conflated. Interpretations include that Cain was given leprosy, or his forehead sprouted a horn, or the sacred name of God was inscribed on his arm and forehead as a protective sigil. Others suggest maybe God just gave him a dog as protection, which might also have been seen as a curse, as there are no positive references to dogs in the Hebrew Bible. The worst explanation is that the mark of Cain was dark skin, an idea used as a justification for slavery and racism well into the 20th century. The book of Genesis tells us that after God cursed Cain, Cain left the presence of the Lord and ended up in a place east of the Garden of Eden called Nod, which means wandering. Once there, he builds a city, presumably the world's first, and that is the last we hear of Cain in biblical canon. However, the Jewish historian Josephus, in his work Antiquities, expands somewhat on the further adventures of the world's first murderer. Rather than repent of his great crime and turn to a life of peace after having been spared God's wrath, Cain doubles down on his wickedness and becomes something of an innovator in the world of evil. Josephus states Cain dedicated himself to the pursuit of pleasure and wealth at any cost, including perpetrating theft and violence upon his neighbors. He built up a great amount of wealth through theft and strong-arming, and encouraged his friends to do the same. This allows him to build an army of terrible dudes led by Cain himself. Cain is also credited with creating weights and measures, which might seem like a positive thing, but Cain used the idea to make sure no one was being accidentally generous by innocently giving too much. He likewise invented the idea of property lines and drawing up fortifications to protect one's belongings with violence. A common question that arises after someone hears the biblical accounts of creation is how you populate a whole world with only 4 people when 3 of them are men, all of them are related, and 1 of them is dead. Well, even if we only look at canonical sources, we know that Adam and Eve had another child after the death of Abel, whom they named Seth. Seth is the son through whom the family line of Adam continues on to Noah, David, and then ultimately the Messiah, which was Jesus if you're a Christian, and not Jesus if you're not a Christian. As Seth was the natural counterpoint to his brother Cain, he became a symbol of good in the way that Cain came to represent evil. Seth would ultimately become the figurehead of a line of Christian sects known as the Sethian Gnostics, who viewed Adam's third son as the mediator of divine wisdom to mankind. But if your question continues, okay, but you need 2 to tango, where were the ladies? Rabbis have the answer. It's taught that Cain was born with a twin sister, and Abel was born a triplet with two sisters, whom the Bible simply neglects to mention. Each brother was intended to marry his twin. This might strike you as pretty gross, but God granted them special dispensation.
Right, Wonder Brother. And for that, we'll need a little Exor handiwork.
Wonder Twin powers, activate!
Genesis tells us Cain had a wife, and the two of them had a son named Enoch, after whom Cain named his great city. This raises something of an obvious question. Who was Cain's wife? Literally all the Bible says is she and Cain did the deed and had a baby. Some believe God had created more people who were not born of Adam and Eve, and Cain encountered these people in Nod. But others think that Cain's wife had to be one of the other sons and daughters of Adam and Eve mentioned in Genesis chapter 5. Some sources, including the Book of Jubilees, says Cain's wife was his sister Awan, while Abel's wife was their sister Azurah, who would marry Seth after Abel's murder. The descendants of Cain were known for their wickedness, just like their father. Josephus says that even within Adam's lifetime, the lineage of Cain had become a corrupt mess, with each new generation more evil than the last. But they are credited with some significant innovations as well. Cain's descendant Lamech invented polygamy, while Jubal invented music, including the lyre and the pipe. Tubal-Cain invented metalworking and was skilled in warfare. While Abel never appears in the Hebrew scriptures again after his death in Genesis, he is mentioned a couple of times in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 23, Jesus compares himself to Abel, whom he names as the first martyr, whose righteous blood would be upon the head of all the hypocrites persecuting the Son of God. The epistle to the Hebrews, meanwhile, contrasts the blood of Jesus and the blood of Abel, with Jesus' death bringing mercy, while Abel's blood cried out for vengeance from the earth on which it was spilled. The role of the first martyr who cries out for justice and retribution is later applied to Abel in the Jewish text, the Book of Enoch. That's a different Enoch, by the way, not Cain's son. In chapter 22 of Enoch, which, like Jubilees, is canonical for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the title character is taken on a tour of the afterlife. After having been introduced to the archangels and shown the ultimate fate of the fallen angels who were affixed to the heavens as stars, Enoch is shown the underworld. He sees that it's divided into 4 smooth pits representing 4 kinds of people: the righteous who prospered, the righteous who suffered, the wicked who prospered, and the wicked who suffered. Abel is named as the chief spirit among the martyrs, crying out for vengeance against the seed of Cain. Despite there only being a few biblical references to him, Michael, the leader of the angelic army, is arguably the most popular of the archangels. His importance in Judaism, Catholicism, and even Islam cannot be understated. Let's look at the untold truth of the Archangel Michael. Michael the Archangel plays a particularly important role in Catholicism. According to the Book of Revelation, Michael was at the forefront during the Great War in heaven. It is in this war where the rebellious angel Lucifer and his minions were thrown out of God's kingdom. Some significant religious figures, such as St. Basil and Thomas Aquinas, have even referred to him as a prince among the angels. Michael is one of only 3 recognized archangels mentioned by name in the Bible. The other 2 are Raphael, who is introduced in the book of Tobit, and Gabriel, who is identified in the Gospel of Luke. The book of Enoch, which is not officially included in the Catholic Bible, names 4 other archangels. They are Uriel, Sarakel, Raguel, and Remiel. Due to the leadership role he holds, many recognize Michael as the greatest among the 7. Some even argue that Michael is the only true archangel. The Epistle of St. Jude bestows this title upon him. No other named angel in the Bible shares this honor. The idea of other archangels may have stemmed from Michael being called one of the chief princes in the book of Daniel. It suggests that there may be others who share his rank. Despite Michael's prominence, much of his background story is shrouded in mystery. Existing knowledge about the Archangel Michael is limited to the times his name pops up in the Bible. All in all, Michael's name appears 4 times in the religious text, twice in the book of Daniel, once in the Epistle of St. Jude, and once in the book of Revelation. When the Archangel Michael is first mentioned in Daniel chapter 10, verses 10 through 14, the prophet identifies him as one of the chief princes, revealed to him by a vision. Michael appears a second time in Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. There he is said to be the great prince who will stand with the people during the end times. Meanwhile, Jude chapter 9 reveals that Michael was contending with the devil about the prophet Moses' remains. This mention of Michael is especially significant for 2 reasons. It is the first and only time Michael is referred to as an archangel, and it contains the only words Michael speaks in the Bible, directed at Satan: "The Lord rebuke you." Lastly, Michael is mentioned in Revelation chapter 12, verse 7, described as the one leading the angels of heaven into battle against the dragon, a manifestation of Satan. The battle ends with Michael and his forces triumphant, throwing the devil and the angels he recruited down into the fiery pits of hell. The Archangel Michael's mentions in the Bible have helped establish him as the top dog of the angels, which suggests that he's quite powerful in the heavenly realm. Interestingly, Catholics have historically regarded him as a powerful force even on earth. They have invoked his name in prayers and religious ceremonies. The founding fathers of the church strongly believed that the Archangel Michael played pivotal roles during monumental events in the history of Catholicism. For starters, they raised the possibility that Michael was the angel guarding the entrance to the Garden of Eden. He ensured that the first man and woman would not be able to enter once more after they were cast out. Michael may have also been the messenger who published the Ten Commandments. He is also believed to have decimated the Assyrian king Sennacherib's army and blocked Balaam's way after the prophet incurred God's ire. Historical Egyptian Christians also held a feast for the Archangel Michael patterned after the Greek celebration, which falls on November 12th. They entrusted the Nile River's safety and life-giving properties to the heavenly warrior. Nowadays, the Archangel Michael's name is typically invoked in exorcism rites, especially when done to kick demons out of certain locations, as well as in various prayers. One notable example is the Tridentine Mass version of the Confiteor, a prayer of acknowledging one's sins and repenting for them. Based on the instances in which Michael the Archangel was mentioned in the Bible, Catholics believe that the chief prince fulfills four important roles. As a guardian of the church, it is the Archangel Michael's responsibility to protect believers' souls from Satan's power, particularly when they are about to die. Related to this and the account of the war in heaven, Michael is also the arch-nemesis of Satan and the former angels under his command. He's tasked with leading the angels in fighting the legions of hell up until the end times. Thirdly, he is the Archangel of Death, whose job is to ensure the safe passage of the souls of the faithful departed from the earthly realm to the Lord's presence. In Michael, communicating with the Archangel for guidance and protection, author Richard Webster writes that the Archangel has an interesting job. He gives the dying one last shot at redemption to Satan's immense dismay. His final responsibility is to be the protector of God's people, the Jews in the Old Testament and the believers of today. The Archangel Michael is perhaps best known for being the constant thorn in Satan's side. As a commander of the angelic army, Michael is the devil's direct enemy and is often depicted triumphing over his foe. There are 2 chapters in the Bible believed to describe the downfall of Lucifer, the former light-bringer of heaven. Verses from Ezekiel chapter 28 tell the story of a magnificent being whom God, quote, anointed as a guardian cherub until wickedness was found in him, when he schemed to usurp the Creator's throne. Meanwhile, Isaiah chapter 14 verses 12 through 15 references how the morning star fell so low, cast out of heaven, and brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. The few accounts in the Bible about the Archangel Michael and Lucifer cover the full extent of what Catholics know about their eternal battle. It may sound odd for an angelic army commander to be connected to healing, but that's exactly how the Archangel Michael has been perceived by believers for centuries. Interestingly, the Jews entrusted their sick, not just their military victories, to the Archangel. Part of what spurred this belief was a story about the sudden appearance of a medicinal spring near the ancient city of Colossae in Phrygia. According to legend, bathing in the spring while invoking the names of Michael and the Holy Trinity cured many believers. As the warrior leading the angelic army into battle, the Archangel Michael is often shown as a knight warrior decked out in armor and brandishing powerful weapons. Illustrations of the Archangel Michael typically have him wearing a helmet with a sword in one hand and a shield with the Latin inscription Quis ut Deus in the other. Less frequently, some works of art highlight his role in the final judgment. They equip him with either the Book of Life or a pair of weighing scales. The scales are for weighing the souls of the departed. His nemesis in most of these depictions is often Satan in dragon form, usually defeated and lying at the Archangel's feet. Sometimes Michael is shown goring the creature with a lance or spear. In the book of Daniel, a vision reveals to the prophet that Michael will play a role in the deliverance of the people of Israel. Now, it's not entirely clear what the Archangel's role will entail. Nevertheless, it has helped forge the idea that Michael would act as an advocate of the Jews, and that he may even serve as a high priest who would help them attain salvation at the end of the world.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
In an earlier passage in Daniel, an angel appears before the prophet who has been mourning and fasting for 3 weeks. The otherworldly being explains to Daniel that a battle against the kings of Persia has delayed his journey to the prophet. In fact, it was only through the intervention in the battle by Michael that Daniel was able to continue his journey. He then warns Daniel of what lies ahead for the Jews. Daniel stops to return to the fight he had left, adding that the Archangel Michael was his only ally in that battle. Traditionally, angels are not supposed to play any part in mediating between God and the chosen people, which makes Michael's role as Israel's guardian and advocate unique. This has led to the creation of 2 prayers directly asking Michael to be Israel's intercessor. Michael also plays an important part in Islam. Known as Mikael, the angel is associated with divine providence and food security due to his role as the giver of rain. Similar to his role as Israel's guardian, Mikael is also recognized as the angel of mercy. He is often found interceding on humanity's behalf so that Allah may grant them salvation. Additionally, Mikael acts as a guardian angel, keeping sacred ground safe and rewarding kind acts. Out of all the archangels, only Michael and Gabriel, called Jibril in the text, are explicitly mentioned by name in the Quran, the holy book of Islam. In Quran chapter 2, verse 98, the 2 archangels are established to be on Allah's side against disbelievers. Muslim faith also establishes the existence of other major angels. These include Israel or Azrael, called the angel of death, and Israfil or Raphael, who will blow the trumpet on the day of judgment. The Islamic prophet Muhammad met both Mikael and Jibril, with the former sitting on his left side and the latter on his right. During this encounter, the angels asked him to recite the Quran. Interestingly, Mikael is described as a very serious angel by Jibril, who reportedly said that he has not laughed since the creation of the hellfire. Devotion to the Archangel Michael predates all other angelic devotions, tracing its roots to 300 to 400 CE in the East. A century later, the Western Church began observing an annual feast day honoring Michael and the other angels called Michaelmas or Michael's Mass. Michaelmas is said to be the Christian equivalent of the autumn equinox. It marks both a change in weather patterns and a starting point for many important sectors of society. For the English, Michaelmas often meant that it was time to elect new officials, begin the academic and fiscal years, and hire new servants. Meanwhile, the Irish liked to fish on Michaelmas, believing that good luck would bring them a great catch. A 3-day fast before Michaelmas was also enacted into law back in 1014 CE, during which servants were prohibited to work. Interestingly, paying rent coincided with Michaelmas, with food, typically a goose, becoming the preferred currency. The Isle of Skye parish even held a procession on Michaelmas, complete with a special cake called St. Michael's Bannock. For Christians, the distinction between the Archangel Michael and Jesus Christ is clear. The former is the battle commander of God's angelic host, while the latter is the Son of God who died on the cross for the sins of the people. However, many believe that Michael may be more than just an archangel. He may be Christ himself before becoming human and after rising from the dead. Based on their interpretation of how Michael is described in the Bible, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the archangel and Christ are the same. They cite Michael's depiction in the Epistle of St. Jude as the only archangel as proof. They claim that it suggests that there is only one angel and point out that the term archangel occurs in the Bible only in the singular, never in the plural. They also cite 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16 as proof of Christ's association with the term archangel, as the verse describes Christ descending from heaven with an archangel's voice. Meanwhile, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints upholds that the Archangel Michael was actually the first man, Adam, before he became mortal. They base this partially on how they interpret the meaning of his Hebrew name. However, they also recognize his role as angelic commander and Satan's chief enemy and regard Jesus Christ as a separate entity. Mary Magdalene has been a symbol for Christian penitence for almost 2,000 years. She's often been confused with other women named Mary in the Bible, but Mary Magdalene was quite a unique character on her own. Here's the truth about Mary Magdalene. The image of Mary Magdalene most people have in their heads comes from centuries of misinformation. If you know anything about her, it's that she was a prostitute who left her sinful ways behind to follow Jesus. But the prostitute in Luke's gospel who washes Jesus' feet with her hair doesn't actually have a name, and there's no reason to think it was Mary Magdalene. And no one probably ever would have conflated the two, but then Pope Gregory jumped in. Based on pretty much nothing at all, he decreed that 3 people mentioned in various parts of the Bible were actually the same person: the nameless prostitutes, Mary the sister of Lazarus, and Mary Magdalene. It wasn't until 1969 that the Catholic Church admitted they got it wrong, and those women were really 3 different people. Current biblical scholarship paints a very different picture of Mary Magdalene, one that is trickling down into the public consciousness through films like 2019's Mary Magdalene. The Independent called her, quote, a feminist figure. She came from a thriving fishing village and appears to have been an extraordinarily independent woman for her time, indicating she probably had a high social status. Unlike most women in the Gospels, she isn't identified by her relationship to a father or a brother. She's just Mary, following Jesus because she wants to. It's theorized she even had her own money and probably supported Jesus financially in some way. Far from the lowly penitent she's been portrayed as throughout history, she was a strong, important disciple whose name and reputation were belittled by men in power with an agenda.
I will not be silent.
If you're familiar with the Gospels, you may have noticed that a lot of the time they don't agree on things. When you compare them, they seem to often tell very different versions of the same story. But one thing that is consistent across all 4 Gospels is the importance of Mary Magdalene. While many of the apostles barely get name-checked in the Gospels or even are missing entirely, Mary Magdalene appears in all 4 Gospels. Both Mark and Luke say she started following Jesus after he cast some demons out of her, and all 4 Gospels agree she was present at Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. This last bit is where she emerges as a hugely important figure. Mark and John claim she alone was the first person to see Jesus return, while Matthew and Luke have her as part of a small group of women. Either way, she is also the first person to tell people that Jesus had risen, leading to the tradition of calling her the Apostle of the Apostles.
For that hour or two, Mary Magdalene was the only one who knew about the resurrection, and so Mary Magdalene was the church.
The fact that Mary Magdalene is singled out as having this unbelievably significant role across 4 books that are rarely so consistent really singles her out. It makes her more than just a devoted follower. It indicates she was one of the first leaders of the Christian religion. Not every book about the life of Jesus and his disciples made it into the Bible. Some of them were even lost for centuries and just turn up randomly. According to the BBC, this happened in Cairo in 1896. A German scholar was shopping in a bazaar and came across a papyrus book bound in leather and written in Coptic. It turned out to be the Gospel of Mary. The author is unknown, but Time says scholars think it was written in the 2nd century or even earlier. The mysterious book isn't officially recognized by the church, so it's known as one of the apocryphal texts. Still, it tells an interesting story that makes Mary Magdalene's role even more significant. The story says Jesus was insistent his disciples should go preach his teachings to the world, but the men are scared they will be killed too. It's Mary who steps up and has to remind the apostles that Jesus will always be with them. She brings up a private conversation she had with Jesus and explains his teachings for them. Then some of the guys get mad. They can't believe Jesus would single out a woman like that, or that they should listen to her since she's just a chick. Peter, who would go on to be the first pope, even sees her as a rival for leadership. The point the gospel hits home is that Mary Magdalene was the one disciple who really got Jesus. In the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown introduced the world to the theory that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were married, but he certainly wasn't the first or the last person to speculate about their relationship. The problem is, the 4 official Gospels have a serious gap in Jesus' life. He goes from newborn to about 30 years old in a few lines. That leaves room for people to speculate about what he was doing in between. According to the authors of the 2014 book The Lost Gospel, he got married to Mary Magdalene and they had 2 kids. The Daily Beast says the authors made this assertion based on a 6th century document called The Story of Joseph and Asenath. On the surface, the book is about the Old Testament figure with the Technicolor Dreamcoat, but the authors claim it's really about Jesus and Mary Magdalene, with the names changed so the original writer wouldn't be killed for what was revealed. Mainstream Christian scholars, though, have dismissed the book out of hand as a bunch of bunk. Leonardo da Vinci's fresco The Last Supper is a masterpiece. It's also given rise to some weird conspiracy theories about Mary Magdalene. All 4 of the Gospels include the story of Jesus' final meal, but none of them mention Mary Magdalene was there, just the 12 apostles. In Leonardo's painting, the character to Jesus' right is John, caught mid-swoon after learning one of them would betray Christ. He has long hair and a very feminine face. This has led some people, most famously author Dan Brown, to believe it wasn't actually John but Mary Magdalene. But Leonardo depicted lots of very effeminate-looking dudes in his other paintings and drawings. Pretty guys were a hallmark of his work. Plus, including Mary Magdalene would have been heresy at a time when the Catholic Church was on an Inquisition bender. Da Vinci would have been risking a lot for no real reason. He was an inventor and an artist, not someone running around trying to challenge church teachings. Despite that, there's another theory Mary Magdalene is secretly in the Last Supper. The Telegraph says in 2007, an amateur scholar found her hidden figure by superimposing the fresco with its mirror image, then making them both partially transparent. He says this reveals a woman, Mary Magdalene, holding a baby, but no one else seems to be buying it. Mary Magdalene was associated with hair for a long time because of the church's conflation of her and the nameless prostitute who washed Jesus' feet and then dried him with her hair. This gave artists an excuse to draw her with exquisite locks, but somewhere along the line, it took a weird turn. Daily Art magazine reports a legend grew that after she witnessed Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, Mary Magdalene went off into the wilderness. She spent years there all by herself, just fasting and praying. Obviously, she didn't have time to go shopping or even think about something as mundane and earthly as clothes, so eventually her clothes fell apart. In order to protect her modesty, God made her hair grow like crazy. Depending on which version you believe, this either meant her head hair grew crazy long or that her whole body grew thick hair like a wolf lady. For hundreds of years, artists depicted her both ways. But this story also gets Mary Magdalene confused with a different Mary. It was actually Saint Mary of Egypt who lived in the wilderness, but since the church seems to think everyone named Mary is the same person, the hairy Mary Magdalene legend grew. Other people think Mary Magdalene took an alternate journey once Jesus went up to heaven. According to the Catholic Travel Guide, a different legend says she and about 70 other early Christians were being persecuted for their beliefs and were eventually put in a boat without sails or oars and pushed out to sea to die. But God intervened and the boat ended up landing safely in France, where a kind local took the refugees in. After that, Mary Magdalene traveled around spreading the gospel for a while before she decided to go live in a cave. Eventually, she died, and her bones stayed there for over 1,000 years. The book The Making of the Magdalene relates that Charles II of France is supposed to have been divinely inspired to find Mary's remains. Well, he definitely found someone's bones in 1279 and gave them to the local Dominican monks to look after. They put her skull in a gold and jeweled holder, which is super creepy, but also recently allowed artists to do a 3D rendering of her face. So, is it really Mary Magdalene? We'll probably never know. If you ever wondered why you ran around looking for eggs when you were a kid, it might be partially down to Mary Magdalene. There are plenty of theories as to why Christians dye eggs, but the Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne reports that there are 2 colored egg legends that involve Mary Magdalene, and they came from the Eastern Catholic and Orthodox churches. The first story says that when Mary went to Jesus' tomb to anoint his body, she brought a basket of hard-boiled eggs, possibly as a lunch for her and the other ladies. But then Jesus appeared to them totally not dead, and the eggs suddenly turned either bright red or rainbow-colored. The other tale says that after Jesus went back up to heaven, Mary decided to go to Rome and see the Emperor Tiberius to yell at him for crucifying Jesus in the first place. Everyone who saw the emperor was supposed to bring him a present, so she showed up with one of her trusty eggs. She gave it to Tiberius and explained that Christ had risen. The emperor wasn't having it, saying it was just as impossible for someone to rise from the dead as for the egg to change color. That's when the egg is supposed to have miraculously turned red. Hey, makes more sense than some other theories. Mary Magdalene has always been a fan favorite, but it wasn't until recently that the Catholic Church recognized her as extra special. She was a saint from the very beginning of the church, but her day on the Catholic calendar, July 22nd, was just a memorial. The Catholic News Service reports that in 2016, Pope Francis finally elevated it to a feast day, or the kind of celebration reserved for the really important saints. Within the Catholic Church, it finally put her on par with the 12 male apostles in terms of significance. This was an official recognition of her role as the Apostle of Apostles. The Pope said she was a true and authentic evangelizer and called her out for her special place in Jesus' life, as well as her role in spreading the gospel after he was gone. One archbishop, writing in the Vatican newspaper, said the elevation of her feast day was meant to highlight the relevance of this woman who showed great love for Christ and was much loved by Christ. About time. The Bible may be the guiding light for most of the monotheistic religions out there, but you don't have to dig deep into the text to find a whole bunch of truly grisly stories. From undead armies to horrific executions to straight-up genocide, these are the most disturbing parts of the Bible. Be warned, the following video includes references to violence, incest, and sexual assault. In Ezekiel 37:1-14, the eponymous prophet has a vision of a valley filled with dry bones. On the instructions of God, Ezekiel tells the bones to come to life, and sure enough, he begins to hear a strange rattling. Suddenly, the bones are coming back together, building themselves into skeletons. Tendons, flesh, and skin begin to grow, and on the orders of God, Ezekiel restores the bodies to life, creating a vast army. God tells Ezekiel to tell his people, "I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel." Despite sounding more like a scene from Hellraiser, Ezekiel's vision is actually meant to be uplifting. Ezekiel's vision occurs while he and his people are exiled after the destruction of their temple. In essence, God has put on a hugely dramatic show for them to bring them out of their despair. Some interpret this story as a promise that there can and will be an afterlife, but it can also be read as a call to keep faith no matter what. This interpretation made the story popular with black ministers at the end of the 19th century. It was even the inspiration for the classic spiritual song Dem Bones. The Tower of Babel is a just-so story explaining why people on Earth speak so many different languages. In Genesis 11:1-9, everyone speaks the same tongue, and because they can communicate, they're able to cooperate in turn. So the people of the world come together to build a massive city, with a tower so tall that the upper spire will reach the heavens themselves. When God sees the tower, however, he is a little put off by how much humans can accomplish by working together. He decides to scatter humans across the earth and confuse their language so that people would never be able to work together again. The most common interpretation of the story is that God is punishing mankind for its pride, but some people explain God's behavior here as a criticism of imperialism. According to one academic paper titled The Tower of Babel and the Origin of the World's Cultures, the emphasis on one language at the beginning of the story represents the imperial suppression of local languages and cultures, and God's punishment brings down the empire, setting free the local languages and cultures to flourish. The Bible is full of violent deaths, but the fates of two enemies of Christ, King Herod and Judas Iscariot, are particularly horrific. To historians, King Herod is famed as a great builder and a diplomat. Thanks to the Bible, however, he is remembered as a straight-up genocidal maniac. This is mostly due to the story in which Herod has the infants in his kingdom executed, hoping that he will kill the baby Jesus in the process. In Acts 12:20-23, an angel of the Lord then smites King Herod in a particularly gruesome way. He is devoured by worms. There are many different accounts of the death of Judas Iscariot. Matthew 27:3-10 is the most famous, suggesting that he hanged himself after Jesus' execution. The writings of Papias suggest that he swelled up and bloated so much that he began to ooze with pus and worms before killing himself by pouring out his innards onto the ground. But Acts 18:2 might be the most brutal of all, suggesting that Judas fell headlong into one of his fields and essentially burst open. So yeah, not a happy ending for Judas. There are 4 methods of execution suggested by the Bible. Arguably, the most gruesome of all is stoning. Stoning refers to an execution in which a group of people throw rocks at the condemned until they're killed. Sometimes the victim would be naked, which would allow the blows to kill them more quickly. A trade-off, of course, is that this method seems particularly excruciating and humiliating. Deuteronomy offers a few situations that might merit the stoning. For example, Deuteronomy 21:18-21 states that if there is a stubborn and rebellious son who won't listen to his parents, all the men of his city should stone him to death. Meanwhile, Deuteronomy 22:13-21 states that if a man believes his wife was not a virgin when they married, and her father cannot provide proof of her virginity, she'll be due for a stoning too. It's hard to argue that the Bible's explicit endorsement of this practice is anything but utterly barbaric. Exodus 20-21, which contains several familiar 10 commandments as thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal, also has a few rules about buying and selling human beings.
We will not live by your commandments, we're free.
There is no freedom without the law.
One line states that if a servant dies while being beaten by their master, then he should be punished. However, if they survive for a day or two after the beating, there will be no punishment for the master. Nice, huh? This representation of slavery in the Bible has even been used to justify slavery in recent history. Many advocates for slavery in the early modern period depended on a literal reading of the Bible, which they claimed represented the mind and will of God himself. In their eyes, because it appeared in the Holy Scripture, slavery wasn't merely justified, it was actually a moral imperative. It probably won't come as much of a surprise to find that the Bible is rife with misogyny. In Leviticus 12, God tells Moses, "A woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period." The passage goes on to state that it will take 33 days for her to be fully purified. If the baby was a girl, it would take twice as long. Meanwhile, Deuteronomy 22:28-29 states that if a man sexually assaults a virgin, he must pay her father a fine. Then the woman and her rapist must get married, and they can never get divorced. Some have attempted to interpret these rules in a way that is less harsh towards women, while others have pointed out that Jesus doesn't advocate for them in the New Testament. Whether those arguments are themselves convincing, however, is another matter entirely. Although human sacrifice would be considered an abomination by biblical rules, the Bible does include stories in which people plan to sacrifice human beings, including their own children. Many are familiar with the story in Genesis in which Abraham is told to sacrifice his only son to God as a test of his loyalty, only to be stopped at the last second by an angel. But Jephthah, the ancient Israelite judge and warrior, was not so lucky. In Judges 11:30-31, Jephthah swears to God that if he is victorious in his upcoming battle, he will make a burnt offering sacrifice of whatever comes out of the door of his home when he returns. In a chilling twist, when Jephthah returns, it is his young daughter who comes out to greet him. Judges 11:39 states, "And he did to her as he had vowed." The book of Job addresses the question of why bad things happen to good people, and in Job's case, it all comes down to a bet. Job is a pious man. Even God himself says there is no man on earth as blameless as he is. But the devil suggests to God that Job is only loyal because things are easy for him. So God accepts the devil's challenge and decides to test Job's loyalty by ruining his entire life. maybe he was just in a bad mood. First, God kills Job's children and destroys his home, but Job continues to praise him. Then God has the devil give Job a horrific skin condition. His friends believe he must have sinned or God wouldn't have punished him. Job, on the other hand, appears to have had a change of heart and argues that God is simply tormenting him for no real reason, which isn't entirely incorrect. God then tells Job that he's way out of his depth, suggesting he knows little of the real world. Ultimately, God gives Job everything he had before and more. It's worth noting, however, that some critics even argue Job's restoration isn't part of the original text. In Genesis 19:4-8, two angels come to the city of Sodom. They plan to spend the night in the town square, but the sodomite Lot urges them not to. Instead, the two angels stay with Lot's family. That night, every single man in Sodom surrounds the house, demanding that Lot send the two angels out. So Lot makes the mob an offer, saying, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please." But the mob refuses. When the city of Sodom is subsequently destroyed by God, Lot and his family make their escape, but Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt for looking back at the burning city. This leaves Lot alone with the 2 virgin daughters he had tried to sacrifice to the mob. By Genesis 19:30-38, Lot and his daughters have gone into hiding. The 2 young women worry that they will never have children since they aren't able to meet any men. Distraught by this knowledge, they get their father drunk and then sleep with him as a way of continuing their family line. Horrifically, this actually works, and both daughters become pregnant by their own father. And then, of course, you have the cannibal mothers. There are many forms of violence against infants in the Bible, but one of the most horrific incidents takes place in 2 Kings 6:24-33. In this tale, Israel's king Jehoram is asked to rule on a particularly gruesome case. The kingdom is going through a terrible famine, and when a woman asks for an audience, he assumes she is there to ask for food. Instead, the woman is there to ask for justice because her friend didn't go through with her side of a deal. When all of their food ran out, the 2 women made a bargain that they would kill and eat their own infant children. According to the text, the woman says, "This woman said to me, 'Give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. And on the next day I said to her, 'Give your son that we may eat him,' but she has hidden her son." The woman seems to hope that the king will force her friend to give up her child, but all he can do is freak out. Can you blame him? Noah's Ark is one of the best-known Bible stories, partially because all those animals make it particularly appealing to children. Look closer, though, and you'll see that this tale is anything but family-friendly. In Genesis, God intends to wipe every living creature off the face of the earth because he feels that they have sinned. He warns Noah, however, so that he'll have enough time to build a large boat, enough for him, his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives, as well as 2 of each kind of animal. God then sends the flood, and sure enough, it kills every single living thing on the planet. The only survivors are those on the ark, who are told to repopulate the earth when God says, "As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it." Of course, because there was only 1 pair of each animal and 8 humans on the ark, this would mean that all the animals on the planet are descended from 2 animals. It would also mean that every human being alive today is descended from the incestuous coupling of Noah's descendants. But hey, that's the Bible for you.
Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.